Chapter 10. The Colonel and his friend. Colonel Jeffrey was not at all satisfied with the state of affairs, as regarded the disappointment of Mr. Thornhill, for whom he entertained a sincere regard, both on account of the private estimation in which he held him, and on account of actual services rendered to Thornhill by him. Not to detain Johanna Oakley in the Temple Gardens, he had stopped his narrative completely at the point when what concerned her had ceased, and had said nothing of much danger which the ship Neptune and its crew and passengers had gone through. After Mr. Thornhill had been taken on board with his dog, the fact is, the storm which he had mentioned was only the first of a series of gales of wind that buffeted the ship about for some weeks, doing it much damage, and enforcing almost the necessity of putting in somewhere for repairs. But a glance at the map will be sufficient to show that, situated as the Neptune was the nearest port at which they could at all expect assistance, was the British colony at the Cape of Good Hope. But such was the contrary nature of the winds and waves, that just upon the evening of a tempestuous day, they found themselves bearing down close inshore on the eastern coast of Madagascar. There was much apprehension that the vessel would strike on a rocky shore, but the water was deep, and the vessel rode well. There was a squall, and they let go both anchors to secure the vessel, as they were so close inshore, lest they should be driven in and stranded. It was fortunate they had so secured themselves, for the gale while it lasted blew half a hurricane, and the ship lost some of her mast, and some other trifling damage, which, however, entailed upon them the necessity of remaining there a few days, to cut timber to repair their masts, and to obtain a few supplies. There is but little to interest a general reader in the description of a gale. Order after order was given until the masts and spars went one by one, and then the orders for clearing the wreck were given. There was much work to be done, and but little pleasure in doing it, for it was wet and miserable while it lasted, and there was the danger of being driven upon a lee shore and knocked to pieces upon the rocks. This danger was averted, and they anchored safe at a very short distance from the shore in comparative security. "We are safe now," remarked the captain, as he gave his second-in-command charge of the deck, and approached Mr. Thornhill and Colonel Jeffrey. "I am happy it is so," replied Jeffrey. "Well, captain," said Mr. Thornhill, "I am glad we have done with being knocked about. We are anchored, and the water here appears smooth enough." "It is so, and I dare say it will remain so. It is a beautiful basin of water, deep and good anchorage, but you see it is not large enough to make a fine harbor." "True, but it is rocky." "It is, and that may make it sometimes dangerous, though I don't know that it would be so in some gales. The sea may beat in at the opening, which is deep enough for anything to enter. Evening Noah's Ark would enter easily enough." "What will you do now?" "Stay here a day or so, and send boats ashore to cut some pine trees, to refit the ship with masts." "You have no staves, then?" "Not enough for such a purpose, and we never do go out stored with such things." "You obtain them wherever you may go to." "Yes, any part of the world will furnish them in some shape or other." "When you send ashore, will you permit me to accompany the boat's crew?" said Jeffrey. "Certainly. But the natives of this country are violent and intractable, and should you get into any row with them, there is every probability of your being captured, or some bodily injury done you. But I will take care to avoid all that." "Very well, Colonel, you shall be welcome to go." "I must beg the same permission," said Mr. Thornhill, "for I should much like to see the country, as well as to have some acquaintance with the natives themselves." "By no means trust yourself alone with them," said the captain, "for if you live you will have cause to repent it. Depend upon what I say." "I will," said Thornhill. "I will go nowhere but where the boat's company goes." "You will be safe then. But do you apprehend any hostile attack from the natives?" inquired Colonel Jeffrey. "No, I do not expect it. But such things have happened before today, and I have seen them when least expected. Though I have been on this coast before, and yet I never met with any ill treatment. But there have been many who have touched on this coast, who have had a brush with the natives and come off second best, the natives generally retiring when the ship's company musters strong in number, and calling out the chiefs, who come down in great force. that we may not conquer them. The next morning the boats were ordered out to go ashore with crews, prepared for cutting timber and obtaining such staves as the ship was in want of. With these boats old Thornhill and Colonel Jeffrey went both of them on board, and after a short ride they reached the shore of Madagascar. It was a beautiful country, and one in which vegetables appear luxuriant and abundant, and the party in search of timber for shipbuilding purposes soon came to some lordly monarchs of the forest, which would have made vessels of themselves. But this was not what was wanted, but, where the trees grew thicker and taller, they began to cut some tall pine trees down. This was the wood they most desired. In fact, it was exactly what they wanted. But they hardly got through a few such trees when the natives came down upon them, apparently to reconnoiter. At first they were quiet and tractable enough, but anxious to see and inspect everything, being very inquisitive and curious. However, that was easily borne, but at length they became more numerous and began to pilfer all they could lay their hands upon, which, of course, brought resentment, and after some time, a blow or two was exchanged. Colonel Jeffrey was forward, and endeavoring to prevent some violence being offered to one of the woodcutters. In fact, he was interposing himself between the two contending parties, and tried to restore order and peace. But several armed natives rushed suddenly upon him, secured him, and were hurrying him away to death before any one could stir in his behalf. His doom appeared certain, for, had they succeeded, they would have cruelly and brutally murdered him. However, just at that moment aid was at hand, and Mr. Thornhill, seeing how matters stood, seized a musket from one of the sailors and rushed after the natives who had Colonel Jeffrey. There were 3 of them. 2 others had gone on to apprise, it was presumed, the chiefs. When Mr. Thornhill arrived, they had thrown a blanket over the head of Jeffrey, but Mr. Thornhill in an instant hurled one down with a blow from the butt end of his musket, and the second met the same fate. As he turned to see what was the matter, the third, seeing the colonel free and the musket leveled at his own head, immediately ran after the other 2, to avoid any serious consequences to himself. Thornhill rescues Colonel Jeffrey from the savages. Thornhill rescues Colonel Jeffrey from the savages. Thornhill, you have saved my life, said Colonel Jeffrey, excitedly. Come away, don't stop here, to the ship, to the ship. And as he spoke, they hurried after the crew, and they succeeded in reaching the boats and the ship in safety, congratulating themselves not a little upon so lucky an escape from a people quite warlike enough to do mischief, but not civilized enough to distinguish when to do it. When men are far away from home, and in foreign lands with the skies of other climes above them, their hearts become more closely knit together in those ties of brotherhood which certainly ought to actuate the whole universe, but which as certainly do not do so, except in very rare instances. One of these instances, however, would be found in the conduct of Colonel Jeffrey and Mr. Thornhill, evening under any circumstances, for they were most emphatically what may be termed kindred spirits. But when we come to unite to that fact the remarkable manner in which they had been thrown together, and the mutual services that they had it in their power to render to each other, we should not be surprised at the almost romantic friendship that arose between them. It was then that Thornhill made the colonel's breast the depository of all his thoughts and all his wishes, and a freedom of intercourse and a community of feeling ensued between them, which, when it does take place between persons of really congenial dispositions, produces the most delightful results of human companionship. No one who has not endured the tedium of a sea voyage can at all be aware of what a pleasant thing it is to have someone on board, in the rich stores of whose intellect and fancy one can find a never-ending amusement. The winds may now whistle through the cordage, and the waves toss the great ship on their foaming crests. Still Thornhill and Jeffrey were together, finding in the amid of danger solace in each other's society, and each animating the other to the performance of deeds of daring that astonished the crew. The whole voyage was one of the greatest peril, and some of the oldest seamen on board did not scruple, during the continuance of their night watches, to intimate to their companions that the ship, in their opinion, would never reach England, and that she would founder somewhere along the long stretch of the African coast. The captain, of course, made every possible exertion to put a stop to such prophetic sayings, but when once they commenced, in a short time there is no such thing as completely eradicating them, and they, of course, produced the most injurious effect, paralyzing the exertions of the crew in times of danger, and making them believe that they are in a doomed ship, and consequently all they can do is useless. Sailors are extremely superstitious on such matters, and there cannot be any reasonable doubt but that some of the disasters that befell the Neptune on her homeward voyage from India may be attributed to this feeling of fatality getting hold of the seamen, and inducing them to think that, let them try what they may, they could not save the ship. It happened that after they had rounded the cape, a dense fog came on, such as had not been known on that coast for many a year, although the western shore of Africa at some seasons of the year is rather subject to such a species of vaporous exhalation. Every object was wrapped in the most profound gloom, and yet there was a strong eddy or current of the ocean flowing parallel with the land, and as the captain hoped, rather off than on the shore. Still there was a suspicion that the ship was making leeway, which must eventually bring it on shore, by some of the low promontories that were by the maps indicated to be upon the coast. In consequence of this fear, the greatest anxiety prevailed on board the vessel, and lights were left burning on all parts of the deck, while two men were continually engaged making soundings. It was about half an hour after midnight, as the chronometer indicated a storm, that suddenly the men, who were on watch on the deck, raised a loud cry of dismay. They had suddenly seen close onto the larboard bow lights which must belong to some vessel that, like the Neptune, was encompassed in the fog, and a collision was quite inevitable, for neither ship had time to put about. The only doubt, which was a fearful and an agonizing one to have solved, was whether the stronger vessel was of sufficient bulk and power to run them down, or they it, and that fearful question was one which a few moments must settle. In fact, almost before the echo of that cry of horror which had come from the men had died away, the vessels met. There was a hideous crash, one shriek of dismay and horror, and then all was still. The Neptune, with considerable damage and some of her bulwarks stove in, sailed on, but the other ship went, with a surging sound, to the bottom of the sea. Alas! Nothing could be done. The fog was so dense that, coupled, too, as it was with the darkness of the night, there could be no hope of rescuing one of the ill-fated crew of the ship, and the officers and seamen of the Neptune, although they shouted for some time, and then listened to hear if any survivors of the ship that had been run down were swimming, no answer came to them, and when in about 6 hours more, they sailed out of the fog into a clear sunshine, where there was not so much as a cloud to be seen, they looked at each other like men newly awakened from some strange and fearful dream. They never discovered the name of the ship they had run down, and the whole affair remained a profound mystery. When the Neptune reached the port of London, the affair was repeated, and every exertion was made to obtain some information concerning the ill-fated ship that had met with so fearful a doom. Such were the circumstances which awakened all the liveliest feelings of gratitude on the part of Colonel Jeffrey towards Mr. Thornhill, and therefore was it that he considered it a sacred duty, now that he was in London, and had the necessary leisure to do so, to leave no stone unturned to discover what had become of him. After deep and anxious thought, and feeling convinced that there was some mystery which it was beyond his power to discover, he resolved upon asking the opinion of a friend, likewise in the army, a Captain Rathbone, concerning the whole of the facts. This gentleman, and a gentleman he was in the fullest acceptance of the term, was in London. In fact, he had retired from active service, and inhabited a small but pleasant house in the outskirts of the metropolis. It was one of those old-fashioned cottage residences, with all sorts of odd places and corners about it, and a thriving garden full of fine old wood, such as are rather rare near to London, and which are daily becoming more rare, in consequence of the value of land immediately contiguous to the metropolis not permitting large pieces to remain attached to small residences. Captain Rathbone had an amiable family about him, such as he was and may well be proud of, and was living in as great a state of domestic felicity as this world could very well afford him. It was to this gentleman, then, that Colonel Jeffrey resolved upon going to lay all the circumstances before him concerning the probable fate of poor Thornhill. This distance was not so great but that he could walk it conveniently, and he did so, arriving, towards the dusk of the evening, on the following day to that which had witnessed his deeply interesting interview with Johanna Oakley in the Temple Gardens. There is nothing on earth so delightfully refreshing, after a dusty and rather a long country walk, as to suddenly enter a well-kept and extremely verdant garden, and this was the case especially to the feelings of Colonel Jeffrey when he arrived at Lime Tree Lodge, the residence of Captain Rathbone. He met him with a most cordial and frank welcome, a welcome which he expected, but which was none the less delightful on that account. And after sitting a while with the family in the house, he and the captain strolled into the garden, and then Colonel Jeffrey commenced his revelation. The captain, with very few interruptions, heard him to an end, and when he concluded by saying, "And now I am come to ask your advice upon all these matters," the captain immediately replied, in his warm, offhand manner, "I'm afraid you won't find my advice of much importance, but I offer you my active cooperation in anything you think ought to be done or can be done in this affair, which, I assure you, deeply interests me, and gives me the greatest possible impulse to exertion. You have but to command me in the matter, and I am completely at your disposal." I was quite certain you would say as much, but, notwithstanding the manner in which you shrink from giving an opinion, I am anxious to know what you really think with regard to what are, you will allow, most extraordinary circumstances. "The most natural thing in the world," said Captain Rathbone, at the first flush of the affair, "seemed to be that we ought to look for your friend Thornhill at the point where he disappeared, at the barber's in Fleet Street." "Precisely. Did he leave the barber, or did he not?" "Sweeney Todd says that he left him, and proceeded down the street towards the city, in pursuance of a direction he had given him to Mr. Oakley, the spectacle maker, and that he saw him get into some sort of disturbance at the end of the market. But to put against that, we have the fact of the dog remaining by the barber's door, and his refusing to leave it on any amount of solicitation. Now the very fact that a dog could act in such a way proclaims an amount of sagacity that seems to tell loudly against the presumption that such a creature could make any mistake. It does. What say you, now, to go into town tomorrow morning, and making a call at the barber's, without proclaiming we have any special errand except to be shaved and dressed? Do you think he would know you again? Scarcely, in plain clothes. I was in my undress uniform when I called with the captain of the Neptune, so that his impression of me must be of decidedly a military character, and the probability is that he would not know me at all in the clothes of a civilian. I like the idea of giving a call at the barber's. Do you think your friend Thornhill was a man likely to talk about the valuable pearls he had in his possession? Certainly not. I merely ask you, because they may have offered a great temptation, and if he has experienced any foul play at the hands of the barber, the idea of becoming possessed of such a valuable treasure may have been the inducement. I do not think it probable, but it has struck me that, if we obtain any information whatever of Thornhill, it will be in consequence of these very pearls. They are of great value, and not likely to be overlooked, and yet, unless a customer be found for them, they are of no value at all, and nobody buys jewels of that character but from the personal vanity of making, of course, some public display of them. That is true, and so, from hand to hand, we may trace those pearls until we come to the individual who must have had them from Thornhill himself, and who may be forced to account most strictly for the manner in which they came into his possession. After some more desultory conversation upon the subject, it was agreed that Colonel Jeffrey should take a bed for the night at Lime Tree Lodge, and that, in the morning, they should both start for London, and, disguising themselves as respectable citizens, make some attempts, by talking about jewels and precious stones, to draw out the barber into a confession that he had something of the sort to dispose of, and moreover, they fully intended to take away the dog, with the care of which Captain Rathbone charged himself. We may pass over the pleasant, social evening which the colonel passed with the amiable family of the Rathbones, and skipping likewise a conversation of some strange and confused dreams which Geoffrey had during the night concerning his friend Thornhill, we will presume that both the colonel and the captain have breakfasted, and that they have proceeded to London and are at the shop of a clothier in the neighbourhood of the Strand, in order to procure coats, wigs, and hats that should disguise them for their visit to Sweeney Todd. Then, arm in arm, they walked towards Fleet Street, and soon arrived opposite the little shop within which there appears to be so much mystery. "The dog, you perceive, is not here," said the colonel. "I had my suspicions, however, when I passed with Johanna Oakley that something was amiss with him, and I have no doubt but that the rascally Barber has fairly compassed his destruction." "If the Barber be innocent," said Captain Rathbone, "you must admit that it would be one of the most confoundedly annoying things in the world to have a dog continually at his door assuming such an aspect of accusation, and in that case I can scarcely wonder at his putting the creature out of the way." "No, presuming upon his innocence, certainly. But we will say nothing about all that, and remember we must come in as perfect strangers, knowing nothing of the affair of the dog, and presuming nothing about the disappearance of any one in this locality." "Agreed. Come on. If he should see us through the window hanging about at all or hesitating, his suspicions will be at once awakened, and we shall do no good." They both entered the shop, and found Sweeney Todd wearing an extraordinary singular appearance, for there was a black patch over one of his eyes, which was kept in its place by a green ribbon that went round his head, so that he looked more fierce and diabolical than ever, and having shaved off a small whisker that he used to wear, his countenance, although to the full as hideous as ever, certainly had a different character of ugliness to that which had before characterized it, and attracted the attention of the colonel. That gentleman would hardly have known him again anywhere but in his own shop, and when we come to consider Sweeney Todd's adventures of the preceding evening, we shall feel not surprised that he saw the necessity of endeavoring to make as much change in his appearance as possible for fear he should come across any of the parties who had chased him, and who, for all he knew to the contrary, may, quite unsuspectingly, drop in to be shaved in the course of the morning, perhaps to retail at that acknowledged mart for all sorts of gossip, a barber's shop, some of the very incidents which he has so well qualified himself to relate. "Shaved and dressed, gentlemen," said Sweeney Todd as his customers made their appearance. "Shaved only," said Captain Rathbone, who had agreed to be principal spokesman, in case Sweeney Todd should have any remembrance of the colonel's voice, and so suspect him. "Pray be seated," said Sweeney Todd to Colonel Geoffrey. "I'll soon polish off your friend, sir, and then I'll begin upon you. Would you like to see the morning paper, sir? It's at your service." "I was just looking myself, sir, at a most mysterious circumstance, if it's true, but you can't believe, you know, sir, all that is put in newspapers." Thank you," said the colonel. Captain Rathbone sat down to be shaved, for he had purposely omitted that operation at home, in order that it should not appear a mere excuse to get into Sweeney Todd's shop. "Why, sir," continued Sweeney Todd, "as I was saying, it is a most remarkable circumstance." "Truly, yes, sir. An old gentleman of the name of Fiddler had been to receive a sum of money at the west end of the town, and has never been heard of since. That was yesterday, sir, and here is a description of him in the papers of today. A snuff-colored coat and velvet smalls, black velvet, I should have said, silk stockings and silver shoe buckles, and a gold-headed cane with W.D.F. upon it, meaning William Dumpledown Fiddler, a most mysterious affair, gentlemen." A sort of groan came from the corner of the shop, and, on the impulse of the moment, Colonel Geoffrey sprang to his feet, exclaiming, "What's that? What's that? Oh, it's only my apprentice, Tobias Ragg. He has got a pain in his stomach from eating too many of Lovett's pork pies. Ain't that it, Tobias, my bud?" "Yes, sir," said Tobias with another groan. "Oh, truly," said the colonel, "it ought to make him more careful for the future." "It's to be hoped it will, sir. Tobias, do you hear what this gentleman says? It ought to make you more careful in future. I am too indulgent to you, that's the fact. Now, sir, I believe you are as clean-shaved as ever you were in your life." Why, yes, said Captain Rathbone, I think that will do very well. And now, Mr. Green, addressing the colonel by that assumed name, and now, Mr. Green, be quick, or we shall be too late for the Duke, and so lose the sale of some of our jewels. We shall truly, said the colonel, if we don't mind. We sat too long over our breakfast at the inn, and his grace is too rich and too good a customer to lose. He don't mind what price he gives for things that take his fancy, or the fancy of his duchess. Jewel merchants, gentlemen, I presume, said Sweeney Todd. Yes, we have been in that line for some time, and by one of us trading in one direction, and the other in another, we manage extremely well because we exchange what suits our different customers and keep up two distinct connections. A very good plan, said Sweeney Todd. I'll be as quick as I can with you, sir. Dealing in jewels is better than shaving. I dare say it is. Of course, it is, sir. Here have I been slaving for some years in this shop, and not done much good, that is to say. When I talk of not having done much good, I admit I have made enough to retire upon quietly and comfortably, and I mean to do so very shortly. There you are, sir, shaved with celerity you seldom meet with, and as clean as possible for the small charge of 1 penny. Thank you, gentlemen, there's your change. Good morning. They had no resource but to leave the shop, and when they had gone Sweeney Todd, as he stropped the razor he had been using upon his hand, gave a most diabolical grin, muttering, "Clever, very ingenious, but it won't do. Oh dear, no, not at all. I'm not so easily taken in. Diamond merchants, and no objection, of course, to deal in pearls, a good jest that, truly, a capital jest. If I had been accustomed to be so easily defeated, I had not now been here a living man. Tobias, I say." "Yes, sir," said the lad, dejectedly. "Have you forgotten your mother's danger in case you breathe the syllable of anything that has occurred here, or that you think has occurred here, or so much as dream of?" "No," said the boy, "truly I have not. I never can forget it, if I were to live 100 years. That's well, prudent, excellent, Tobias. Go out now, and if those two persons who were here last waylay you in the street, let them say what they will, and do you reply to them as shortly as possible. But be sure you come back to me quickly and report what they do say. They turn to the left, towards the city. Now be off with you." "It's of no use," said Colonel Jeffrey to the captain. "The barber is either too cunning for me, or he is really innocent of all participation in the disappearance of Thornhill. And yet there are suspicious circumstances." I watched his countenance when the subject of jewels was mentioned, and I saw a sudden change come over it. It was but momentary, but still it gave me a suspicion that he knew something which caution alone kept within the recesses of his breast. The conduct of the boy, too, was strange. And then again, if he has the string of pearls, their value would give him all the power to do what he says he is about to do, viz. To retire from business with an independence. Hush! There, did you see that lad? Yes, why it's the barber's boy. It is the same lad he called Tobias. Shall we speak to him? Let's make a bolder push, and offer him an ample reward for any information he may give us. Agreed, agreed. They both walked up to Tobias, who was listlessly walking along the streets, and when they reached him, they were both struck with the appearance of care and sadness that was upon the boy's face. He looked perfectly haggard and careworn, an expression sad to see upon the face of one so young, and, when the colonel accosted him in a kindly tone, he seemed so unnerved that tears immediately darted to his eyes, although at the same time he shrank back as if alarmed. "My lad," said the colonel, "you reside, I think, with Sweeney Todd, the barber. Is he not a kind master to you, that you seem so unhappy?" "No, no, that is, I mean yes, I have nothing to tell. Let me pass on. What is the meaning of this confusion?" "Nothing, nothing. I say, my lad, here is a guinea for you, if you will tell us what became of the man of a seafaring appearance who came with a dog to your master's house some days since, to be shaved." "I cannot tell you," said the boy. "I cannot tell you what I do not know. But you have some idea, probably. Come, we will make it worth your while, and by that protect you from Sweeney Todd. We have the power to do so, and all the inclination. But you must be quite explicit with us, and tell us frankly what you think, and what you know concerning the man in whose fate we are interested. I know nothing, I think nothing, said Tobias. Let me go, I have nothing to say, except that he was shaved and went away. But how came he to leave his dog behind him? I cannot tell. I know nothing. It is evident that you do know something, but hesitate either from fear or some other motive to tell it. As you are inaccessible to fair means, we must resort to others, and you shall at once come before a magistrate, who will force you to speak out. Do with me what you will, said Tobias, I cannot help it. I have nothing to say to you, nothing whatever. Oh, my poor mother, if it were not for you. What then? Nothing, nothing, nothing. It was but a threat of the colonel to take the boy before a magistrate, for he had really no grounds for so doing, and if the boy chose to keep a secret, if he had one, not all the magistrates in the world could force words from his lips that he felt not inclined to utter, and so, after one more effort, they felt that they must leave him. Boy, said the colonel, you are young, and cannot well judge of the consequences of particular lines of conduct. You ought to weigh well what you are about, and hesitate long before you determine keeping dangerous secrets. We can convince you that we have the power of completely protecting you from all that Sweeney Todd could possibly attempt. Think again, for this is an opportunity of saving yourself perhaps from much future misery that may never arise again. I have nothing to say, said the boy. I have nothing to say. He uttered these words with such an agonized expression of countenance that they were both convinced he had something to say, and that, too, of the first importance, a something which would be valuable to them in the way of information, extremely valuable probably, and yet which they felt the utter impossibility of wringing from him. They were compelled to leave him, and likewise with the additional mortification that, far from making any advance in the matter, they had placed themselves and their cause in a much worse position, in so far as they had awakened all Sweeney Todd's suspicions if he were guilty, and yet advanced not one step in the transaction. And then, to make the matter all the more perplexing, there was still the possibility that they may be altogether upon a wrong scent, and that the barber of Fleet Street had no more to do with the disappearance of Mr. Chapter 11. The Stranger at Lovett's. Towards the dusk of the evening of that day, after the last batch of pies at Lovett's had been disposed of, there walked into the shop a man most miserably clad, and who stood for a few moments staring with weakness and hunger at the counter before he spoke. Mrs. Lovett was there, but she had no smile for him, and instead of its usual bland expression, her countenance wore an aspect of anger, as she forestalled what the man had to say, by exclaiming, "Go away, we never give anything to beggars." There came a flush of color for the moment across the features of the stranger, and then he replied, "Mistress Lovett, I do not come to ask alms of you, but to know if you can recommend me to any employment." "Recommend you? Recommend a ragged wretch like you? I am a ragged wretch, and, moreover, quite destitute. In better times I have sat at your counter, and paid cheerfully for what I wanted, and then one of your softest smiles has ever been at my disposal. I do not say this as a reproach to you, because the cause of your smile was well known to be a self-interested one, and when that cause had passed away, I can no longer expect it. But I am so situated that I am willing to do anything for a mere subsistence. Oh, yes, and then when you get into a better case again, I have no doubt but you have quite sufficient insolence to make you unbearable. Besides, what employment can we have but pie making? And we have a man already who suits us very well, with the exception that he, as you would do if we were to exchange him, has grown insolent, and fancies himself master of the place." The stranger at Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. The stranger at Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. "Well, well," said the stranger, "of course, there is always sufficient argument against the poor and destitute to keep them so. If you will assert that my conduct will be the nature you describe, it is quite impossible for me to prove the contrary." He turned and was about to leave the shop, but Mrs. Lovett called after him, saying, come in again in 2 hours. He paused a moment or two, and then, turning his emaciated countenance upon her, said, I will if my strength permit me. Water from the pumps in the street is but a poor thing for a man to subsist upon for 24 hours. You may take one pie. The half-famished, miserable-looking man seized upon a pie and devoured it in an instant. My name, he said, is Jarvis Williams. I'll be here, never fear, Mrs. Lovett, in 2 hours, and, notwithstanding all you have said, you shall find no change in my behavior because I may be well kept and better clothed. But if I should feel dissatisfied with my situation, I will leave it, and no harm done. So saying, he walked from the shop, and when he was gone, a strange expression came across the countenance of Mrs. Lovett, and she said in a low tone to herself, he may suit for a few months, like the rest, and it is clear that we must get rid of the one we have. I must think of it. There is a cellar of vast extent, and of dim and sepulchral aspect. Some rough red tiles are laid upon the floor, and pieces of flint and large jagged stones have been hammered into the earthen walls to strengthen them, while here and there rough huge pillars made by beams of timber rise perpendicularly from the floor, and prop large flat pieces of wood against the ceiling, to support it. Here and there gleaming lights seem to be peeping out from furnaces, and there is a strange hissing, simmering sound going on, while the whole air is impregnated with a rich and savory vapor. This is Lovett's Pie Manufactory beneath the pavement of Belliard, and at this time a night batch of some thousands is being made for the purpose of being sent by carts the first thing in the morning all over the suburbs of London. By the earliest dawn of day a crowd of itinerant hawkers of pies would make their appearance, carrying off a large quantity to regular customers who had them daily, and no more thought of being without them than of forbidding the milkman or the baker to call at their residences. It will be seen and understood, therefore, that the retail part of Mrs. Lovett's business, which took place principally between the hours of 12 and 1, was by no means the most important or profitable portion of a concern which was really of immense magnitude, and which brought in a large yearly income. To stand in the cellar when this immense manufacture of what, at first sight, would appear such a trivial article was carried on, and to look about as far as the eye could reach, was by no means to have a sufficient idea of the extent of the place, for there were as many doors in different directions and singular low-arched entrances to different vaults, which all appeared as black as midnight, that one may almost suppose the inhabitants of all the surrounding neighborhood had, by common consent, given up their cellars to Lovett's Pie Factory. There is but one miserable light, except the occasional fitful glare that comes from the ovens where the pies are stewing, hissing, and spluttering in their own luscious gravy. There is but one man, too, throughout all the place, and he is sitting on a low three-legged stool in one corner, with his head resting upon his hands, and gently rocking to and fro, as he utters scarcely audible moans. He is but lightly clad. In fact, he seems to have but little on him except a shirt, and a pair of loose canvas trousers. The sleeves of the former are turned up beyond his elbows, and on his head he has a white nightcap. It seems astonishing that such a man, evening with the assistance of Mrs. Lovett, could make so many pies as are required in a day. But then, system does wonders, and in those cellars there are various mechanical contrivances for kneading the dough, chopping up the meat, and which greatly reduced the labor. But what a miserable object is that man! What a sad and soul-stricken wretch he looks! His face is pale and haggard, his eyes deeply sunken, and, as he removes his hands from before his visage, and looks about him, a more perfect picture of horror could not have been found. I must leave tonight, he said, in coarse accents. I must leave tonight. I know too much, my brain is full of horrors. I have not slept now for 5 nights, nor dare I eat anything but the raw flour. I will leave tonight if they do not watch me too closely. Though, if I could but get into the streets, if I could but once again breathe the fresh air. Hush! What's that? I thought I heard a noise. He rose, and stood trembling and listening, but all was still, save the simmering and hissing of the pies, and then he resumed his seat with a deep sigh. All the doors fastened upon me, he said. What can it mean? It's very horrible, and my heart dies within me. 6 weeks only have I been here. Only 6 weeks. I was starving before I came. Alas, alas, how much better to have starved. I should have been dead before now and spared all this agony. Skinner, cried a voice, and it was a female one. Skinner, how long will the ovens be? A quarter of an hour, a quarter of an hour, Mrs. Lovett. God help me. What is that you say? I said, God help me. Surely a man may say that without offense. A door slammed shut, and the miserable man was alone again. How strangely, he said, on this night my thoughts go back to early days, and to what I once was. The pleasant scenes of my youth recur to me. I see again the ivy-mantled porch and the pleasant village green. I hear again the merry ringing laughter of my playmates, and there, in my mind's eye, appears to me the bubbling stream, and the ancient mill, the old mansion house, with its tall turrets, and its air of silent grandeur. I hear the music of the birds, and the winds making rough melody among the trees. It is very strange that all those sights and sounds should come back to me at such a time as this, as if just to remind me what a wretch I am. He was silent for a few moments, during which he trembled with emotion. Then he spoke again, saying, Thus the forms of those whom I once knew, and many of whom have gone already to the silent tomb, appear to come thronging round me. They bend their eyes momentarily upon me, and, with settled expressions, show acutely the sympathy they feel for me. I see her, too, who first, in my bosom, lit up the flame of soft affection. I see her gliding past me like the dim vision of a dream, indistinct, but beautiful, no more than a shadow, and yet to me most palpable. What am I now? What am I now? He resumed his former position, with his head resting upon his hands. He rocked himself slowly to and fro, uttering those moans of a tortured spirit, which we have before noticed. But see, one of the small arch doors open, in the gloom of those vaults, and a man, in a stooping posture, creeps in. A half-mask is upon his face, and he wears a cloak, but both his hands are at liberty. In one of them he carries a double-headed hammer, with a powerful handle, of about 10 inches in length. He has probably come out of a darker place than the one into which he now so cautiously creeps, for he shades the light from his eyes, as if it were suddenly rather too much for him, and then he looks cautiously round the vault, until he sees the crouched-up figure of the man whose duty it is to attend the ovens. From that moment he looks at nothing else, but advances towards him, steadily and cautiously. It is evident that great secrecy is his object, for he is walking on his stocking soles only, and it is impossible to hear the slightest sounds of his footsteps. Nearer and nearer he comes, so slowly, and yet so surely, towards him, who still keeps up the low moaning sound, indicative of mental anguish. Now he is close to him, and he bends over him for a moment, with a look of fiendish malice. It is a look which, despite his mask, glances full from his eyes, and then grasping the hammer tightly in both hands, he raises it slowly above his head and gives it a swinging motion through the air. There is no knowing what induced the man that was crouching on the stool to rise at that moment, but he did so, and paced about with great quickness. A sudden shriek burst from his lips as he beheld so terrific an apparition before him, but, before he could repeat the word, the hammer descended, crushing into his skull, and he fell lifeless, without a moan. "And so, Mr. Jarvis Williams, you have kept your word," said Mrs. Lovett to the emaciated, careworn stranger who had solicited employment of her. "And so, Jarvis Williams, you have kept your word, and come for employment?" "I have, madam, and hope that you can give it to me. I frankly tell you that I would seek for something better and more congenial to my disposition, if I could, but who would employ one presenting such a wretched appearance as I do? You see that I am all in rags, and I have told you that I have been half starved, and therefore it is only some common and ordinary employment that I can hope to get, and that made me come to you. Well, I don't see why we should not make a trial of you, at all events. So if you like to go down into the bakehouse, I will follow you, and show you what you have to do. You remember that you have to live entirely upon the pies, unless you like to purchase for yourself anything else, which you may do if you can get the money. We give none, and you must likewise agree never to leave the bakehouse. Never to leave it, never, unless you leave it for good and for all. If upon those conditions you choose to accept the situation, you may, and if not, you can go about your business at once and leave it alone. Alas, madam, I have no resource, but you spoke of having a man already. Yes, but he has gone to his friends. He has gone to some of his very oldest friends, who will be quite glad to see him. So now say the word. Are you willing or are you not to take the situation? My poverty and my destitution consent if my will be averse, Mrs. Love it, but, of course, I quite understand that I leave when I please. Oh, of course, we never think of keeping anybody many hours after they begin to feel uncomfortable. If you be ready, follow me. I am quite ready, and thankful for shelter. All the brightest visions of my early life have long since faded away, and it matters little or truly nothing what now becomes of me. I will follow you, madam, freely, upon the conditions you have mentioned. Mrs. Lovett lifted up a portion of the counter which permitted him to pass behind it, and then he followed her into a small room, which was at the back of the shop. She then took a key from her pocket, and opened an old door which was in the wainscoting, and immediately behind which was a flight of stairs. These she descended, and Jarvis Williams followed her to a considerable depth, after which she took an iron bar from behind another door, and flung it open, showing her new assistant the interior of that vault which we have already very briefly described. These, she said, are the ovens, and I will proceed to show you how you can manufacture the pies, feed the furnaces, and make yourself generally useful. Flour will be always let down through a trapdoor from the upper shop, as well as everything required for making the pies but the meat, and that you will always find ranged upon shelves either in lumps or steaks, in a small room through this door, but it is only at particular times you will find the door open, and whenever you do so, you had better always take out what meat you think you will require for the next batch. I understand all that, madam, said Williams, but how does it get there? That's no business of yours. So long as you are supplied with it, that is sufficient for you. And now I will go through the process of making one pie, so that you may know how to proceed, and you will find with what amazing quickness they can be manufactured if you set about them in the proper manner. She then showed him how a piece of meat thrown into a machine became finely minced up by merely turning a handle, and then how flour and water and lard were mixed up together to make the crust of the pies by another machine, which threw out the paste thus manufactured in small pieces, each just large enough for a pie. Lastly, she showed him how a tray, which just held 100, could be filled, and, by turning a windlass, sent up to the shop, through a square trapdoor, which went right up to the very counter. And now, she said, I must leave you. As long as you are industrious you will go on very well, but as soon as you begin to be idle, and neglect the orders which are sent to you by me, you will get a piece of information which will be useful, and which if you be a prudent man will enable you to know what you are about. What is that? You may as well give it to me now. No, we seldom find there is occasion for it at first, but after a time, when you get well fed, you are pretty sure to want it. So saying, she left the place, and he heard the door by which he had entered carefully barred after her. Suddenly then he heard her voice again, and so clearly and distinctly, too, that he thought she must have come back again. But upon looking up at the door, he found that arose from her speaking through a small grating at the upper part of it, to which her mouth was closely placed. Remember your duty, she said, and I warn you that any attempt to leave here will be as futile as it will be dangerous. Accept with your consent when I relinquish the situation. Oh, certainly, certainly, you are quite right there. Everybody who relinquishes the situation goes to his old friends, whom he has not seen for many years, perhaps. What a strange manner of talking she has, said Jarvis Williams to himself, when he found he was alone. There seems to be some singular and hidden meaning in every word she utters. What can she mean by a communication being made to me, if I neglect my duty? It is very strange. And what a singular looking place this is. I think it would be quite unbearable if it were not for the delightful odor of the pies, and they are truly delicious, perhaps more delicious to me, who has been famished so long, and have gone through so much wretchedness. There is no one here but myself, and I am hungry now, frightfully hungry, and whether the pies be done or not, I'll have half a dozen of them at any rate. So here goes. He opened one of the ovens, and the fragrant steam that came out was perfectly delicious, and he sniffed it up with a satisfaction such as he had never felt before, as regards anything that was eatable. Is it possible, he said, that I shall be able to make such delicious pies? At all events, one can't starve here, and if it be a kind of imprisonment, it's a pleasant one. Upon my soul, they are nice, evening half-cooked, delicious. I'll have another half dozen. There are lots of them. Delightful. I can't keep the gravy from running out of the corners of my mouth. Upon my soul, Mrs. Love it. I don't know where you get your meat, but it's all as tender as young chickens, and the fat actually melts away in one's mouth. Ah, these are pies, something like pies. They are positively fit for the gods. Mrs. Lovett's new man ate 12 threepenny pies, and then he thought of leaving off. It was a little drawback not to have anything to wash them down with but cold water, but he reconciled himself to this, for, as he said, after all it would be a pity to take the flavor of such pies out of one's mouth. Truly it would be 1,000 pities, so I won't think of it, but just put up with what I have got and not complain. I may have gone further and fared worse with a vengeance, and I cannot help looking upon it as a singular piece of good fortune that made me think of coming here in my deep distress to try and get something to do. I have no friends and no money, she whom I loved is faithless, and here I am, master of as many pies as I like, and to all appearance monarch of all I survey, for there really seems to be no one to dispute my supremacy. To be sure my kingdom is rather a gloomy one, but then I can abdicate it when I like, and when I am tired of those delicious pies, if such a thing be possible, which I really very much doubt, I can give up my situation and think of something else. If I do that, I will leave England forever. It's no place for me after the many disappointments I have had. No friend left me, my girl false, not a relation but who would turn his back upon me. Chapter 12. The resolution come to by Johanna Oakley, the beautiful Johanna, when in obedience to the command of her father she left him, and begged him the beefeater to manage matters with the Rev. Mr. Lupin, did not proceed directly upstairs to her apartment, but lingered on the staircase to hear what ensued, and if anything in her dejected state of mind could have given her amusement, it would certainly have been the way in which the beefeater exacted a retribution from the reverend personage, who was not likely again to intrude himself into the house of the spectacle maker. But when he was gone, and she heard that a sort of peace had been patched up with her mother, a peace which, from her knowledge of the high contracting parties, she conjectured would not last long, she returned to her room, and locked herself in, so that if any attempt were made to get her down to partake of the supper, it may be supposed she was asleep, for she felt herself totally unequal to the task of making one in any party, however much she may respect the individual members that composed it. And she did respect Ben the beefeater, for she had a lively recollection of much kindness from him during her early years, and she knew that he had never come to the house when she was a child without bringing her some token of his regard in the shape of a plaything, or some little article of doll's finery, which at that time was very precious. She was not wrong in her conjectures that Ben would make an attempt to get her downstairs, for her father came up at the beefeater's request, and tapped at her door. She thought the best plan, as truly it was, would be to make no answer, so that the old spectacle maker concluded at once what she wished him to conclude, namely, that she had gone to sleep, and he walked quietly down the stairs again, glad that he had not disturbed her, and told Ben as much. Now, feeling herself quite secure from interruption for the night, Johanna did not attempt to seek repose, but set herself seriously to reflect upon what had occurred. She almost repeated to herself, word for word, what Colonel Jeffrey had told her, and, as she revolved the matter over and over again in her brain, a strange thought took possession of her, which she could not banish, and which, when once it found a home within her breast, began to gather probability from every slight circumstance that was in any way connected with it. This thought, strange as it may appear, was that the Mr. Thornhill, of whom Colonel Jeffrey spoke in terms of such high eulogium, was no other than Mark Ingestry himself. It is astonishing, when once a thought occurs to the mind that makes a strong impression, how, with immense rapidity, a rush of evidence will appear to come to support it. And thus it was with regard to this supposition of Johanna Oakley. She immediately remembered a host of little things which favored the idea, and among the rest, she fully recollected that Mark Ingestry had told her he meant to change his name when he left England, for that he wished her and her only to know anything of him, or what had become of him, and that his intention was to baffle inquiry, in case it should be made, particularly by Mr. Grant, towards whom he felt a far greater amount of indignation than the circumstances at all warranted him in feeling. Then she recollected all that Colonel Jeffrey had said with regard to the gallant and noble conduct of this Mr. Thornhill, and, girl-like, she thought that those high and noble qualities could surely belong to no one but her own lover, to such an extent, and that, therefore, Mr. Thornhill and Mark Ingestry must be one and the same person. Over and over again, she regretted she had not asked Colonel Jeffrey for a personal description of Mr. Thornhill, for that would have settled all her doubts at once, and the idea that she had it still in her power to do so, in consequence of the appointment he had made with her for that day week, brought her some consolation. It must have been he, she said. His anxiety to leave the ship and get here by the day he mentions proves it. Besides, how improbable it is that at the burning of the ill-fated vessel, Ingestry should place in the hands of another what he had intended for me, when that other was quite as likely, and perhaps more so, to meet with death as Mark himself. Thus she reasoned, forcing herself each moment into a stronger belief of the identity of Thornhill with Mark Ingestry, and so certainly narrowing her anxieties to a consideration of the fate of one person instead of two. "I will meet Colonel Jeffrey," she said, "and ask him if this Mr. Thornhill had fair hair and a soft and pleasing expression about the eyes that could not fail to be remembered. I will ask him how he spoke, and how he looked, and get him, if he can, to describe to me evening the very tones of his voice, and then I shall be sure, without the shadow of a doubt, that it is Mark. But then, oh, then comes the anxious question of what has been his fate." When poor Johanna began to consider the multitude of things that may have happened to her lover during his progress from Sweeney Todd's, in Fleet Street, to her father's house, she became quite lost in a perfect maze of conjecture, and then her thoughts always painfully reverted back to the barber's shop where the dog had been stationed, and she trembled to reflect for a moment upon the frightful danger to which that string of pearls may have subjected him. "Alas! Alas!" she cried, "I can well conceive that the man whom I saw attempting to poison the dog would be capable of any enormity. I saw his face but for a moment, and yet it was one never again to be forgotten. It was a face in which may be read cruelty and evil passions. Besides, the man who would put an unoffending animal to a cruel death shows an absence of feeling and a baseness of mind which make him capable of any crime he thinks he can commit with impunity. What can I do? Oh, what can I do to unravel this mystery?" No one could have been more tenderly and gently brought up than Johanna Oakley, but yet, inhabitive of her heart, was a spirit and a determination which few truly could have given her credit for, by merely looking on the gentle and affectionate countenance which she ordinarily presented. But it is no new phenomenon in the history of the human heart to find that some of the most gentle and loveliest of human creatures are capable of the highest efforts of perversion, and when Johanna Oakley told herself, which she did, she was determined to devote her existence to a discovery of the mystery that enveloped the fate of Mark Ingestry. She likewise made up her mind that the most likely man for accomplishing that object should not be rejected by her on the score of danger, and she at once set to work considering what those means should be. This seemed an endless task, but still she thought that if, by any means whatever, she could get admittance to the barber's house, she may be able to come to some conclusion as to whether or not it was there where Thornhill, whom she believed to be Ingestry, had been stayed in his progress. Aid me heaven, she cried, in the adoption of some means of action on the occasion. Is there any one with whom I dare advise? Alas, I fear not, for the only person in whom I have put my whole heart is my father, and his affection for me would prompt him at once to interpose every possible obstacle to my proceeding, for fear danger should come of it. To be sure, there is Arabella Wilmot, my old schoolfellow and bosom friend. She would advise me to the best of her ability, but I much fear she is too romantic and full of odd, strange actions, that she has taken from books, to be a good adviser. And yet what can I do? I must speak to someone, if it be but in case any accident happening to me, my father may get news of it, and I know of no one else whom I can trust but Arabella. After some little more consideration, Johanna made up her mind that on the following morning she would go to the house of her old school friend, which was in the immediate vicinity, and hold a conversation with her. I shall hear something, she said, at least of a kindly and a consoling character, for what Arabella may want in calm and steady judgment, she fully compensates for an actual feeling, and what is most of all, I know I can trust her word implicitly, and that my secret will remain as safely locked in her breast as if it were in my own. It was something to come to a conclusion to ask advice, and she felt that some portion of her anxiety was lifted from her mind by the mere fact that she had made so firm a mental resolution that neither danger nor difficulty should deter her from seeking to know the fate of her lover. She retired to rest now with a greater hope, and while she is courting repose, notwithstanding the chance of the discovered images that fancy may present to her in her slumbers, we will take a glance at the parlor below, and see how far Mrs. Oakley is conveying out the pacific intention she had so tacitly expressed, and how the supper is going forward, which, with not the best grace in the world, she is preparing for her husband, who for the first time in his life had begun to assert his rights, and for Big Ben, the beefeater, whom she as cordially disliked as it was possible for any woman to detest any man. Mrs. Oakley by no means preserved her taciturn demeanor, for after a little she spoke, saying, "There's nothing tasty in the house. Suppose I run over the way to Waggarge's and get some of those Epping sausages with a peculiar flavor." "Ah, do," said Mr. Oakley. "They are beautiful, Ben, I can assure you." "Well, I don't know," said Ben the beefeater. "Sausages are all very well in their way, but you need such a plaguey lot of them, for if you only eat them one at a time, how soon will you get through a dozen or two?" "A dozen or two," said Mrs. Oakley. "Why, there are only 5 to a pound." "Then," said Ben, making a mental calculation, "then, I think, ma'am, that you ought not to get more than 9 pounds of them, and that will be a matter of 45 mouthfuls for us." "Get 9 pounds of them," said Mr. Oakley, "if they be wanted. I know Ben has an appetite." "Truly," said Ben, "but I have fell off lately, and don't take to my wittles as I used. You can order, missus, if you please, a gallon of half and half as you go along. One must have a drain of drink of some sort, and mind you don't be going to any expense on my account, and getting anything but the little snack I have mentioned, for 10 to 1 I shall take supper when I get to the Tower. Only human nature is weak, you know, missus, and requires something to be a continually a holding of it up." "Certainly," said Mr. Oakley, "certainly, have what you like, Ben. Just say the word before Mrs. Oakley goes out. Is there anything else?" "No, no," said Ben. "Oh dear no, nothing to speak of. But if you should pass a shop where they sells fat bacon, about 4 or 5 pounds, cut into rashers, you'll find Missus will help down the blessed sausages." "Gracious Providence," said Mrs. Oakley. "Who is to cook it?" "Who is to cook it, ma'am?" "Why, the kitchen fire, I suppose. But mind ye if the man ain't got any sausages, there's a shop where they sells biled beef at the corner, and I shall be quite satisfied if you brings in about 10 or 12 pounds of that. You can make it up into about half a dozen sandwiches." "Go, my dear, go at once," said Mr. Oakley, "and get Ben his supper. I am quite sure he wants it, and be as quick as you can." "Ah," said Ben, when Mrs. Oakley was gone, "I didn't tell you how I was sarved last week at Mrs. Harvey's. You know they are so precious genteel there that they don't speak above their blessed breaths for fear of wearing themselves out, and they sits down in a chair as if it were balanced only on one leg, and a little more one way or t'other would upset them. Then, if they sees a crumb a-laying on the floor they rings the bell, and a poor half-starved devil of a servant comes and says, "Did you ring, ma'am?" And then they says yes, bring a dust shovel and a broom. There is a crumb a-laying there, and then says I, damn you all, says I, bring the scavenger's cart and half-dozen birch brooms, there's a cinder just fell out of the fire. Then in course they gets shocked and looks as blue as possible, and arter that, when they see as I ain't a-going, one of them says, "Mr. Benjamin Bloomerguts, would you like to take a glass of wine?" "I should think so," says I. Then he says he, "Which would you prefer, red or white?" Says he, "White," says I, "while you are screwing up your courage to pull out the red." So out they pull it, and as soon as I got hold of the bottle, I knocked the neck of it off over the top bar of the fireplace, and then drank it all up. "Now, damn ye," says I, "you thinks all this is mighty genteel and fine, but I don't, and consider you to be the blessedest set of humbugs ever I set my eyes on, and if ever you catch me here again, I'll be genteel too, and I can't say more than that. Go to the devil, all of ye." So out I went, only I met with a little accident in the hall, for they had got a sort of lamp hanging there, and somehow or nother, my head went bang into it, and I carried it out round my neck, but when I did get out, I took it off, and shied it slap in at the parlor window. You never heard such a smash in all your life. I dare say they all fainted away for about a week, the blessed humbugs. "Well, I should not wonder," said Mr. Oakley. "I never go near them, because I don't like their foolish pomposity and pride, which, upon very slender resources, tries to ape what it don't at all understand. But here is Mrs. Oakley with the sausages, and I hope you will make yourself comfortable, Ben." "Comfortable, I believe ye, I rather shall. I means it, and no mistake. I have brought £3, said Mrs. Oakley, and told the man to call in a quarter of an hour, in case there is any more wanted. "The devil you have, and the bacon, Mrs. Oakley, the bacon, I could not get any, the man had nothing but hams. Lor, ma'am, I'd put up with a ham cut thick, and never have said a word about it. I am a angel of a temper, and if you did but know it. Hilloa, look, is that the fellow with the half and half? Yes, here it is, a pot." "A what?" "A pot, to be sure." "Well, I never, you are getting genteel, Mrs. Oakley. Then give us a hold of it." Ben took the pot, and emptied it at a draught, and then he gave a tap at the bottom of it with his knuckles, to signify that he had accomplished that feat, and then he said, "I tells you what, ma'am, if you takes me for a baby, it's a great mistake, and any one would think you did, to see you offering me a pot merely. It's an insult, ma'am." "Fiddle-de-dee," said Mrs. Oakley. "It's a much greater insult to drink it all up, and give nobody a drop." "Is it? I wants to know how you are to stop it, ma'am, when you gets it to your mouth. That's what I axes you, how are you to stop it, ma'am? You didn't want me to spew it back again, did you, ma'am? You vile, low wretch." Come, my dear," said Mr. Oakley, "you know our cousin. Ben don't live among the most refined society, and so you ought to be able to look over a little of his, I may say, I am sure, without offense, roughness now and then. Come, there is no harm done, I'm sure. Forget and forgive, say I. That's my maxim, and has always been, and will always be." "Well," said the beefeater, "it's a good one to get through the world with, and so there's an end of it. I forgives you, Mother Oakley." "You forgive?" "Yes, to be sure. Though I am only a beefeater, I suppose as I may forgive people for all that, Cousin Oakley?" "Oh, of course, Ben, of course." Come, wife, you know as well as I that Ben has many good qualities, and that take him for all in all, as the man in the play says, we shan't in a hurry look upon his like again." "And I'm sure I don't want to look upon his like again," said Mrs. Oakley. "I'd rather by a good deal keep him a week than a fortnight. He's enough to breed a famine in the land, that he is." Oh, bless you, no, said Ben. That's amongst your little mistakes, ma'am, I can assure you. By the by, what a blessed long time that fellow is coming with the rest of the beer and the other sausages. Why, what's the matter with you, Cousin Oakley, eh, old chap? You look out of sorts. I don't feel just the thing, do you know, Ben? Not the thing, why, now you come to mention it, I somehow feel as if all my blessed inside was on a turn and a twist. The devil, I don't feel comfortable at all, I don't. And I am getting very ill, gasped Mr. Oakley. And I am getting iller, said the beefeater, manufacturing a word for the occasion. Bless my soul, there's something gone wrong in my inside. I know there's murder, there's a go, oh, Lord. It's a doubling me up, it is. I feel as if my last hour had come, said Mr. Oakley. I'm a dying man, I am, oh, good gracious. There was a twinge. Mrs. Oakley, with all the coolness in the world, took down her bonnet from behind the parlor door where it hung, and, as she put it on, said, I told you both that some judgment would come over you, and now you see it has. How do you like it? Providence is good, of course, to its own, and I have. What? Hissed the half and half. Big Ben, the beefeater, fell off his chair with a deep groan, and poor Mr. Oakley sat glaring at his wife, and shivering with apprehension, quite unable to speak, while she placed a shawl over her shoulders, as she added in the same tone of calmness she had made the terrific announcement concerning the poisoning. Now, you wretches, you see what a woman can do when she makes up her mind for vengeance. As long as you all live, you'll recollect me, but if you don't, that won't much matter, for you won't live long, I can tell you. And now I'm going to my sister's, Mrs. Tidiblow. So saying, Mrs. Oakley turned quickly round, and, with an insulting toss of her head, and not at all caring for the pangs and sufferings of her poor victims, she left the place, and proceeded to her sister's house, where she slept as comfortably as if she had not by any means committed two diabolical murders. But has she done so, or shall we, for the honor of human nature, discover that she went to a neighboring chemist's and only purchased some dreadfully powerful medicinal compound, which she placed in the half and half, and which began to give those pangs to Big Ben, the beefeater, and to Mr. Oakley, concerning which they were both so eloquent? This must have been the case, for Mrs. Oakley could not have been such a fiend in a human guise as to laugh as she passed the chemist's shop. Oh no, she may not have felt remorse, but that is a very different thing, truly, from laughing at the matter, unless it were really laughable and not serious at all. Big Ben and Mr. Oakley must have at length found out how they had been hoaxed, and the most probable thing was that the before-mentioned chemist himself told them, for they sent for him in order to know if anything could be done to save their lives. Ben from that day immediately made a determination that he would not visit Mr. Oakley, and the next time they met he said, I tell you what it is, that old hag, your wife, is one too many for us, that's a fact. She gets the better of me altogether, so, whenever you feels a little inclined for a gossip about old times, just you come down to the tower. I will, Ben, do. We can always find something to drink, and you can amuse yourself, too, by looking at the animals. Remember, feeding time is 2 o'clock, so, now and then, I shall expect to see you, and above all, be sure you let me know if that canting parson, Lupin, comes any more to your house. I will, Ben. Ah, do. And I'll give him another lesson if he should, and I tell you how I'll do it. I'll get a free admission to the wild beastesses in the tower, and when he comes to see for them before sort of fellows always goes everywhere they can go for nothing, I'll just manage to pop him into a cage along of some of the most cantankerous creatures as we have. But would not that be dangerous? Oh dear no, we has a laughing hyena as would frighten him out of his wits, but I don't think as he'd bite him much. Do you know, he's as playful as a kitten, and very fond of standing on his head. Well, then, Ben, I have, of course, no objection, although I do think that the lesson you have already given to the reverend gentleman will and ought to be fully sufficient for all purposes, and I don't expect we shall see him again. But how does Mrs. Oh, behave to you? Asked Ben. Well, Ben, I don't think there's much difference. Sometimes she's a little civil, and sometimes she ain't. It's just as she takes it into her head. Ah, that all comes of marrying. I have often wondered, though, Ben, that you never married. Ben gave a chuckle as he replied, Have you though, really? Well, Cousin Oakley, I don't mind telling you, but the real fact is, once I was very near being served out in that sort of way. Truly, yes, I'll tell you how it was. There was a girl called Angelina Day, and a nice-looking enough creature she was as you'd wish to see, and didn't seem as if she'd got any claws at all, leastways she kept them in, like a cat at meal times. Upon my word, Ben, you have a great knowledge of the world. I believe you, I have. Haven't I been brought up among the wild beasts in the tower all my life? That's the place to get a knowledge of the world in, my boy. I ought to know a thing or two, and in course I does. Well, but how was it, Ben, that you did not marry this Angelina you speak of? I'll tell you. She thought she had me as safe as a hare in a trap, and she was as amiable as a lump of cotton. You'd have thought, to look at her, that she did nothing but smile, and to hear her, that she said nothing but nice, mild, pleasant things, and I really began to think as I had found out the proper sort of animal. But you were mistaken? I believe you, I was. One day I'd been there to see her, I mean, at her father's house, and she'd been as amiable as she could be. I got up to go away, with a determination that the next time I got there I would ask her to say yes, and when I had got a little way out of the garden of the house where they lived, it was out of town some distance, I found I had left my little walking cane behind me, so I goes back to get it, and when I got into the garden I heard a voice. Whose voice? Why, Angelina's, to be sure. She was speaking to a poor little dab of a servant they had, and oh, my eye, how she did rap out, to be sure, such a speech as I never heard in all my life. She went on a matter of 10 minutes without stopping, and every other word was some ill name or another, and her voice, oh, gracious, it was like a bundle of wire all of a tangle, it was. And what did you do, then, upon making such a discovery as that in so very odd and unexpected a manner? Do? What do you suppose I did? I really cannot say, as you are rather an eccentric fellow. Well then, I'll tell you. I went up to the house, and just popped in my head, and says I, Angelina, I find out that all cats have claws after all. Good evening, and no more from your humble servant, who don't mind the job of taming any wild animal but a woman. And then off I walked, and I never heard of her afterwards. Ah, then, it's true enough, you never know them beforehand, but after a little time, as you say, then out come the claws. They does. And I suppose you since then made up your mind to be a bachelor for the rest of your life. Ben, of course I did. After such experience as that, I should have deserved all I got, and no mistake, I can tell you. And if ever you catches me paying any attention to a female woman, just put me in mind of Angelina Day, and you'll see how I shall be off at once like a shot. Ah, said Mr. Oakley, with a sigh, everybody, Ben, ain't born with your good luck, I can tell you. You are a most fortunate man, Ben, and that's a fact. You must have been born under some lucky planet, I think, Ben, or else you never would have had such a warning as you have had about the claws. I found 'em out, Ben, but it was a deal too late, so I had only to put up with my fate, and put the best face I could upon the matter. Yes, that's what learned folks call, what's its name, Phil something. Philosophy, I suppose you mean, Ben. Ah, that's it, you must put up with what you can't help. It means, I take it. It's a fine name for saying you must grin and bear it. I suppose that is about the truth, Ben. It cannot, however, be exactly said that the little incident connected with Mr. Lupin had no good effect upon Mrs. Oakley, for it certainly shook most alarmingly her confidence in that pious individual. In the first place, it was quite clear that he shrank from the horrors of martyrdom, and, truly, to escape any bodily inconvenience, was perfectly willing to put up with any amount of degradation or humiliation that he could be subjected to, and that was, to the apprehension of Mrs. Oakley, a great departure from what a saint ought to be. Then again, her faith in the fact that Mr. Lupin was such a chosen morsel as he had represented himself, was shaken from the circumstance that no miracle in the shape of a judgment had taken place to save him from the malevolence of Big Ben, the beefeater, so that, taking one thing in connection with another, Mrs. Oakley was not near so religious a character after that evening as she had been before it, and that was something gained. Then circumstances soon occurred, of which the reader will very shortly be fully aware, which were calculated to awaken all the feelings of Mrs. Oakley, if she had really any feelings to awaken, and to force her to make common cause with her husband in an affair that touched him to the very soul, and did succeed in awakening some feelings in her heart that had lain dormant for a long time, but which were still far from being completely destroyed. These circumstances were closely connected with the fate of one in whom we hope that by this time the reader has taken a deep and kindly interest. We mean Johanna, that young and beautiful and gentle creature who seemed to have been created with all the capacity to be so very happy, and yet whose fate had become so clouded by misfortune, and who appears now to be doomed through her best affections to suffer so great an amount of sorrow, and to go through so many sad difficulties. Alas, poor Johanna Oakley, better had you loved someone of less aspiring feelings, and of less ardent imagination than he possessed to whom you have given your heart's young affections. It is true that Mark and Jestry possessed genius, and perhaps it was the glorious light that hovers around that fatal gift which prompted you to love him. But genius is not only a blight and a desolation to its possessor, but it is so to all who are bound to the gifted being by the ties of fond affection. Chapter 13. Johanna's interview with Arabella Wilmot, and the advice. Alas, poor Johanna, you have chosen but an indifferent confidante in the person of that young and inexperienced girl to whom it seems good to you to impart your griefs. Not for one moment do we mean to say that the young creature to whom the spectacle maker's daughter made up her mind to unbosom herself was not all that any one could wish as regards honor, goodness, and friendship. But she was one of those creatures who yet look upon the world as a fresh green garden, and had not yet lost that romance of existence which the world and its ways soon banish from the breasts of all. She was young, evening almost to girlhood, and having been the idol of her family circle, she knew just about as little of the great world as a child. But, while we cannot but to some extent regret that Johanna should have chosen such a confidant and admirer, we with feelings of great freshness and pleasure proceed to accompany her to that young girl's house. Now, a visit from Johanna Oakley to the Wilmots was not so rare a thing that it should excite any unusual surprise, but in this case it did excite unusual pleasure, because they had not been there for some time, and the reason that she had not may well be found in the peculiar circumstances that had for a considerable period environed her. She had a secret to keep which, although it may not proclaim what it was most legibly upon her countenance, yet proclaimed that it had an existence, and as she had not made Arabella a confidant, she dreaded the other's friendly questions of the young creature. It may seem surprising that Johanna Oakley had kept from one whom she so much esteemed, and with whom she had made such a friendship, the secret of her affections, but that must be accounted for by a difference of ages between them to a sufficient extent in that early period of life to show itself palpably. That difference was not quite 2 years, but when we likewise state that Arabella was of that small, delicate style of beauty which makes her look like a child, one evening upon the very verge of womanhood, we shall not be surprised that the girl of 17 hesitated to confide a secret of the heart to what seemed but a beautiful child. The last year, however, had made a great difference in the appearance of Arabella, for, although she still looked a year or so younger than she really was, a more staid and thoughtful expression had come over her face, and she no longer presented, at times when she laughed, that childlike expression, which had been as remarkable in her as it was delightful. She was as different looking from Johanna as she could be, for while Johanna's hair was of a rich and glossy brown, so nearly allied to black that it was commonly called such, the long waving ringlets that shaded the sweet countenance of Arabella Wilmot were like amber silk blended to a pale beauty. Her eyes were nearly blue, and not that pale gray, which courtesy calls of that celestial color, and their long, fringing lashes hung upon a cheek of the most delicate and exquisite hue that nature could produce. Such was the young, lovable, and amiable creature who had made one of those girlish friendships with Johanna Oakley that, when they do endure beyond the period of almost mere childhood, endure forever, and become one among the most dear and cherished sensations of the heart. The acquaintance had commenced at school, and may have been of that evanescent character of so many school friendships, which, in after life, are scarcely so much remembered as the most dim visions of a dream, but it happened that they were congenial spirits, which, let them be thrown together under any circumstances whatever, would have come together with a perfect and a most enduring confidence in each other's affections. That they were school companions was the mere accident that brought them together and not the cause of their friendship. Such, then, was the being to whom Johanna Oakley looked for counsel and assistance, and notwithstanding all that we have said respecting the likelihood of that counsel being of an inactive and girlish character, we cannot withhold our meed of approbation to Johanna, that she had selected one so much in every way worthy of her honest esteem. The hour at which she called was such as to ensure Arabella being within, and the pleasure which showed itself upon the countenance of the young girl, as she welcomed her old playmate, was a feeling of the most delightful and unaffecting character. "Why, Johanna," she said, "you so seldom call upon me now, that I suppose I must esteem it as a very special act of grace and favor to see you." "Arabella," said Johanna, "I do not know what you will say to me when I tell you that my present visit is because I am in a difficulty and want your advice. Then you could not have come to a better person, for I have read all the novels in London, and know all the difficulties that anybody can possibly get into, and, what is more important, too, I know all the means of getting out of them, let them be what they may. And yet, Arabella, scarcely in all your novel reading will you find anything so strange and so eventful as the circumstances, I grieve to say, it is in my power to record to you. Sit down and listen to me, dear Arabella, and you shall know all. You surprise and alarm me by that serious countenance, Johanna. The subject is a serious one. I love. Oh, is that all? So do I. There's a young Captain Disbroke in the King's Guards. He comes here to buy his gloves, and if you did but hear him sigh as he leans over the counter, you would be astonished. Ah, but, Arabella, I know you well. Yours is one of those fleeting passions that, like the forked lightning, appear for a moment and before you can say behold, is gone again. Mine is deeper in my heart, so deep that to divorce it from it would be to destroy its home forever. But why so serious, Johanna? You do not mean to tell me that it is possible for you to love any man without his loving you in return? You are right there, Arabella. I do not come to speak to you of a hopeless passion, far from it, but you shall hear. Lend me, my dear friend, your serious attention, and you shall hear of such mysterious matters. Mysterious! Then I shall be in my very element, for know that I quite live and exult in mystery, and you could not possibly have come to any one who would more welcomely receive such a commission from you. I am all impatience. Johanna then, with great earnestness, related to her friend the whole of the particulars connected with her deep and sincere attachment to Mark Ingestry. She told her how, in spite of all circumstances which appeared to have a tendency to cast a shadow and blight upon their young affection, they had loved, and loved truly, how Ingestry, disliking, both from principle and distaste, the study of the law, had quarrelled with his uncle, Mr. Grant, and then how, as a bold adventurer, he had gone to seek his fortunes in the Indian seas, fortunes which promised to be splendid, but which may end in disappointment and defeat, and that they had ended in such calamities most deeply and truly did she mourn to be compelled to state. And she concluded by saying, "And now, Arabella, you know all I have to tell you. You know how truly I have loved, and how, after teaching myself to expect happiness, I have met with nothing but despair, and you may judge for yourself how sadly the fate, or rather the mystery, which hangs over Mark Ingestry must deeply affect me, and how lost my mind must be in all kinds of conjecture concerning him." The hilarity of spirits which had characterized Arabella in the earlier part of their interview, entirely left her as Johanna proceeded in her mournful narration, and by the time she had concluded, tears of the most genuine sympathy stood in her eyes. She took the hands of Johanna in both her own, and said to her, "Why, my poor Johanna, I never expected to hear from your lips so sad a tale. This is most mournful, truly very mournful, and although I was half inclined before to quarrel with you for this tardy confidence, for you must recollect that it is the first I have heard of this whole affair, but now the misfortunes that oppress you are quite sufficient, heaven knows, without me adding to them by the shadow of a reproach. They are truly, Arabella, and believe me, if the course of my love ran smoothly, instead of being, as it has been, full of misadventures, you should have had nothing to complain of on the score of want of confidence. But I will own I did hesitate to inflict on you my miseries, for miseries they have been, and, alas, miseries they seem destined to remain. Johanna, you could not have used an argument more delusive than that. It is not one which should have come from your lips to me. But surely it was a good motive to spare you pain? And did you think so lightly of my friendship that it was to be entrusted with nothing but what wore a pleasant aspect? True friendship surely is best shown in the encounter of difficulty and distress. I grieve, Johanna, truly, that you have so much mistaken me. No, no, you do me an injustice. It was not that I doubted your friendship for one moment, but that I did truly shrink from casting the shadow of my sorrows over what should be, and what I hope is the sunshine of your heart. That was the respect which deterred me from making you a confidant of what I suppose I must call this ill-fated passion. No, not ill-fated, Johanna. Let us still believe that the time will come when it will be far otherwise than ill-fated. But what do you think of all that I have told you? Can you gather from it any hope? Abundance of hope, Johanna. You have no certainty of the death of Ingestry. I certainly have not, as far as regards the loss of him in the Indian seas, but, Arabella, there is one supposition which, from the first moment that it found a home in my breast, has been growing stronger and stronger, and that supposition is that this Mr. Thornhill was no other than Mark Ingestry himself. Truly, think you so? That would be a strange supposition. Have you any special reasons for such a thought? None, further than a something which seemed ever to tell my heart from the first moment that such was the case, and a consideration of the improbability of the story related by Thornhill. Why should Mark Ingestry have given him the string of pearls and the message to me, trusting to the preservation of this Thornhill, and assuming, for some strange reason, that he himself must fall? There is good argument in that, Johanna, and, moreover, Mark Ingestry told me he'd intended altering his name upon the expedition. It is strange, but now you mention such a supposition, it appears, do you know, Johanna, each moment more probable to me. Oh, that fatal string of pearls. Fatal, truly. For if Mark Ingestry and Thornhill be one and the same person, the possession of those pearls has been the temptation to destroy him. There cannot be a doubt upon that point, Johanna, and so you will find in all tales of love and of romance that jealousy and wealth have been the sources of all the abundant evils which fond and attached hearts have from time to time suffered. It is so, I believe, it is so, Arabella. But advise me what to do, for truly I am myself incapable of action. Tell me what you think it is possible to do under those disastrous circumstances, for there is nothing which I will not dare attempt. Why, my dear Johanna, you must perceive that all the evidence you have regarding this Thornhill follows him up to that barber's shop in Fleet Street, and no farther. It does, truly. Can you not imagine, then, that there lies the mystery of his fate? And, from what you have yourself seen of this man, Todd, do you think he is one who would hesitate evening at murder? Oh, horror! My own thoughts have taken that dreadful turn, but I dreaded to pronounce the word which would embody them. If, truly, that fearful-looking man fancied that, by any deed of blood, he could become possessed of such a treasure as that which belonged to Mark Ingestry, unchristian and illiberal as it may sound, the belief clings to me that he would not hesitate to do it. Do not, however, conclude, Johanna, that such is the case. It would appear from all you have heard and seen of these circumstances that there is some fearful mystery, but do not, Johanna, conclude hastily that that mystery is one of death. Be it so or not, said Johanna, I must solve it, or go distracted. Heaven have mercy upon me. For evening now I feel a fever in my brain that precludes almost the possibility of rational thought. Be calm, be calm. We will think the matter over calmly and seriously, and who knows but that, mere girls as we are, we may think of some adventitious mode of arriving at a knowledge of the truth. And now I am going to tell you something which your narrative has recalled to my mind. Say on, Arabella, I shall listen to you with deep attention. A short time since, about 6 months, I think, an apprentice of my father, in the last week of his servitude, was sent to the west end of the town to take a considerable sum of money, but he never came back with it, and from that day to this we have heard nothing of him, although, from inquiry that my father made, he ascertained that he received the money, and that he met an acquaintance in the Strand who parted from him at the corner of Milford Lane, and to whom he said that he intended to call at Sweeney Todd's, the barber, in Fleet Street, to have his hair dressed, because there was to be a regatta on the Thames, and he was determined to go to it whether my father liked or not. And he was never heard of. Never. Of course, my father made every inquiry upon the subject, and called upon Sweeney Todd for the purpose, but, as he declared that no such person had ever called at his shop, the inquiry there terminated. It is very strange, and most mysterious, for the friends of the youth were truly indefatigable in their searches for him, and, by subscribing together for the purpose, they offered a large reward to any one who could or would give them information regarding his fate. And was it all in vain? All. Nothing could be learned whatever. Not even the remotest clue was obtained, and there the affair has rested, in the most profound of mysteries. Johanna shuddered, and for some few moments the two young girls were silent. It was Johanna who broke that silence, by exclaiming, Arabella, assist me with what advice you can, so that I may set about what I purpose with the best prospect of success and the least danger, not that I shrink on my own account from risk, but if any misadventure were to occur to me, I may by that be incapacitated from pursuing that object, to which I will now devote the remainder of my life. But what can you do, my dear Johanna? It was but a short time since there was a placard in the barber's window to say that he wanted a lad as an assistant in his business, but that has been removed, or we may have procured someone to take the situation for the express purpose of playing the spy upon the barber's proceedings. But, perhaps, still there may be an opportunity of accomplishing something in that way, if you knew of any one that would undertake the adventure. There will be no difficulty, Johanna, in discovering one willing to do so, although we may be long in finding one of sufficient capacity that we could trust. But I am adventurous, Johanna, as you know, and I think I could have got my cousin Albert to personate the character, only that I think he's rather a giddy youth, and scarcely to be trusted with a mission of so much importance. Yes, and a mission likewise, Arabella, which, by a single false step, may be made frightfully dangerous. It may truly. Then it will be unfair to place it upon any one but those who feel most deeply for its success. Johanna, the enthusiasm with which you speak awakens in me a thought which I shrink from expressing to you, and which, I fear, perhaps more originates from a certain feeling of romance, which, I believe, is a besetting sin, than from any other cause. Name it, Arabella, name it. It would be possible for you or I to accomplish the object, by going disguised to the barber's, and accepting such a situation, if it were vacant, for a period of about 24 hours, in order that during that time an opportunity may be taken of searching in his house for some evidence upon the subject nearest to your heart. It is a happy thought, said Johanna, and why should I hesitate at encountering any risk, or toil, or difficulty, for him who has risked so much for me? What is there to hinder me from carrying out such a resolution? At any moment, if great danger should beset me, I can rush into the street and claim protection from the passers-by. And moreover, Johanna, if you went on such a mission, remember you go with my knowledge, and that consequently I would bring you assistance, if you appeared not in the specified time for your return. Each moment, Arabella, the plan assumes to my mind a better shape. If Sweeney Todd be innocent of contriving anything against the life and liberty of those who seek his shop, I have nothing to fear. But if, On the contrary, he be guilty, danger to me would be the proof of such guilt, and that is a proof which I am willing to chance encountering for the sake of the great object I have in view. But how am I to provide myself with the necessary means? Be at rest upon that score. My cousin Albert and you are as nearly of a size as possible. He will be staying here shortly, and I will secure from his wardrobe a suit of clothes, which I am certain will answer your purpose. But let me implore you to wait until you have had your second interview with Colonel Jeffrey. That is well thought of. I will meet him and question him closely as to the personal appearance of this Mr. Thornhill. Beside, I shall hear if he has any confirmed suspicion on the subject. That is well. You will soon meet him, for the week is running on. And let me implore you, Johanna, to come to me the morning after you have so met him, and then we will again consult upon this plan of operations, which appears to us feasible and desirable. Some more conversation of a similar character ensued between these young girls, and upon the whole, Johanna Oakley felt much comforted by her visit, and more able to think calmly as well as seriously upon the subject which engrossed her whole thoughts and feelings. And when she returned to her own home, she found that much of the excitement of despair which had formerly had possession of her had given way to hope, and with that natural feeling of joyousness, and that elasticity of mind which belongs to the young, she began to build in her imagination some airy fabrics of future happiness. Chapter 14. Tobias's Threat and Its Consequences. Perhaps one of the most pitiable objects now in our history is poor Tobias, Sweeney Todd's boy, who certainly had his suspicions aroused in the most terrific manner, but who was terrified, by the threats of what the barber was capable of doing against his mother, from making any disclosures. The effect upon his personal appearance of this wear and tear of his intellect was striking and manifest. The hue of youth and health entirely departed from his cheeks, and he looked so sad and careworn that it was quite a terrible thing to look upon a young lad so, as it were, upon the threshold of existence, and in whom anxious thoughts were making such war upon the physical energies. His cheeks were pale and sunken, his eyes had an unnatural brightness about them, and, to look upon his lips, one would think they had never parted in a smile for many a day, so sadly were they compressed together. He seemed ever to be watching likewise for something fearful. An evening as he walked the streets he would frequently turn and look inquiringly around him with a shudder, and in his brief interview with Colonel Jeffrey and his friend the captain, we can have a tolerably good comprehension of the state of his mind, oppressed with fears, and all sorts of dreadful thoughts, panting to give utterance to what he knew and to what he suspected, yet terrified into silence for his mother's sake. We cannot but view him as signally entitled to the sympathy of the reader, and as, in all respects, one sincerely to be pitied for the cruel circumstances in which he was placed. The sun is shining brightly, an evening that busy region of trade and commerce, Fleet Street, is looking gay and beautiful, but not for that poor spirit-stricken lad are any of the sights and sounds which used to make up the delight of his existence, reaching his eyes or ears now with their accustomed force. He sits moody and alone, and in the position which he always assumes when Sweeney Todd is from home, that is to say, with his head resting on his hands, and looking the picture of melancholy abstraction. "What shall I do?" he said to himself. "What will become of me? I think if I live here any longer, I shall go out of my senses. Sweeney Todd is a murderer, I'm quite certain of it, and I wish to say so, but I dare not for my mother's sake. Alas, alas, the end of it will be that he will kill me, or that I shall go out of my senses, and then I shall die in some madhouse, and no one will care what I say." The boy wept bitterly after he had uttered these melancholy reflections, and he felt his tears something of a relief to him, so that he looked up after a little time, and glanced around him. "What a strange thing," he said, "that people should come into this shop, to my certain knowledge, who never go out of it again, and yet what becomes of them I cannot tell." He looked with a shuddering anxiety towards the parlor, the door of which Sweeney Todd took care to lock always when he left the place, and he thought that he should like much to have a thorough examination of that room. I have been in it, he said, and it seems full of cupboards and strange holes and corners, such as I never saw before, and there is an odd stench in it that I cannot make out at all, but it's out of the question thinking of ever being in it above a few minutes at a time, for Sweeney Todd takes good care of that. The boy rose and opened a small cupboard that was in the shop. It was perfectly empty. Now, that's strange, he said. There was a walking stick with an ivory top to it here just before he went out, and I could swear it belonged to a man who came in to be shaved. More than once, and more than twice, too, when I have come in suddenly, I have seen people's hats, and Sweeney Todd would try and make me believe that people go away after being shaved and leave their hats behind them. He walked up to the shaving chair, as it was called, which was a large, old-fashioned piece of furniture made of oak and carved, and as the boy threw himself into it, he said, "What an odd thing it is that this chair is screwed so tight to the floor. Here is a complete fixture, and Sweeney Todd says it is so because it's in the best possible light, and if he were not to make it fast in such a way, the customers would shift it about from place to place, so that he could not conveniently shave them. It may be true, but I don't know." "And you have your doubts," said the voice of Sweeney Todd, as that individual with a noiseless step walked into the shop. "You have your doubts, Tobias. I shall have to cut your throat, that is quite clear." Tobias alarmed at the mysterious appearance of Todd. "No, no, have mercy upon me. I did not mean what I said." "Then it's uncommonly imprudent to say it, Tobias. Do you remember our last conversation? Do you remember that I can hang your mother when I please? Because, if you do not, I beg to put you in mind of that pleasant little circumstance." "I cannot forget. I do not forget. It is well, and mark me, I will not have you assume such an aspect as you wear when I am not here. You don't look cheerful, Tobias, and notwithstanding your excellent situation, with little to do, and the number of Lovett's pies you eat, you fall away." "I cannot help it," said Tobias, "since you told me what you did concerning my mother. I have been so anxious that I cannot help." "Why should you be anxious? Her preservation depends upon yourself, and upon yourself wholly. You have but to keep silent, and she is safe. But if you utter one word that shall be displeasing to me about my affairs, mark me, Tobias, she comes to the scaffold, and if I cannot conveniently place you in the same madhouse where the last boy I had was placed, I shall certainly be under the troublesome necessity of cutting your throat. I will be silent. I will say nothing, Mr. Todd. I know I shall die soon, and then you will get rid of me altogether, and I don't care how soon that may be, for I am quite weary of my life. I shall be glad when it is over." "Very good," said the barber. "That's all a matter of taste. And now, Tobias, I desire that you look cheerful and smile, for a gentleman is outside feeling his chin with his hand and thinking he may as well come in and be shaved." Chapter 15. The second interview between Johanna and the Colonel in the Temple Gardens. Now that there was a great object to gain by a second interview with Colonel Jeffrey, the anxiety of Johanna Oakley to have it became extremely great, and she counted the very hours until the period should arrive when she could again proceed to the Temple Gardens with something like a certainty of finding him. The object, of course, was to ask him for a description of Mr. Thornhill, sufficiently accurate to enable her to come to something like a positive conclusion as to whether she ought to call him to her own mind as Mark and Jestry or not. And Colonel Jeffrey was not a bit the less anxious to see her than she was to look upon him, for although in divers lands he had looked upon many a fair face, and heard many a voice that had sounded soft and musical in his ears, he had seen none that, to his mind, was so fair, and had heard no voice that he had considered really so musical and charming to listen to, as Johanna Oakley's. A man of more honorable and strict sense of honor than Colonel Jeffrey could not have been found, and, therefore, It was that he allowed himself to admire the beautiful under any circumstances, because he knew that his admiration was of no dangerous quality, but that, on the contrary, it was one of those feelings which may exist in a bosom such as his, quite undebased by a meaner influence. We think it necessary, however, before he has his second meeting with Johanna Oakley, to give such an explanation of his thoughts and feelings as it is in our power. When first he met her, the purity of her mind, and the genuine and beautiful candor of all she said, struck him most forcibly, as well as her great beauty, which could not fail to be extremely manifest. After that he began to reason with himself as to what ought to be his feelings with regard to her, namely, what portion of these ought to be suppressed, and what ought to be encouraged. If Mark and Jestry were dead, there was not a shadow of interference or dishonor in him. Colonel Jeffrey, loving the beautiful girl, who was surely not to be shut out of the pale of all affection because the first person to whom her heart had warmed with a pure and holy passion was no more. It may be, he thought, that she is incapable of feeling the sentiment which can at all approach that which once she has felt, but still she may be happy and serene, and may pass many joyous hours as the wife of another. He did not positively make these reflections as applicable to himself, although they had a tendency that way, and he was fast verging to a state of mind which may induce him to give them a more actual application. He did not tell himself that he loved her. No, the word admiration took the place of the more powerful term, but then, can we not doubt that, at this time, the germ of a very pure and holy affection was lighted up in the heart of Colonel Jeffrey for the beautiful creature who suffered the pangs of so much disappointment, and who loved one so well, who, we almost fear, if he were living, was scarcely the sort of person fully to requite such an affection. But we know so little of Mark and Jestry, and there appears to be so much doubt as to whether he be alive or dead, that we should not prejudge him upon such very insufficient evidence. Johanna Oakley did think of taking Arabella Wilmot with her to this meeting with Colonel Jeffrey, but she abandoned the idea, because it really looked as if she was either afraid of him or afraid of herself. So she resolved to go alone, and when the hour of appointment came, she was then walking upon that broad gravelled path, which has been trodden by some of the best, and some of the most eminent, as well as some of the worst of human beings. It was not likely that with the feelings of Colonel Jeffrey towards her, he would keep her waiting. Truly, he was then a good hour before the time, and his only great dread was that she may not come. He had some reason for this dread, because it will be readily recollected by the reader that she had not positively promised to come, so that all he had was a hope that way tending and nothing further. As minute after minute had passed away, she came not, although the time had not yet really arrived. His apprehension that she would not give him the meeting had grown in his mind almost to a certainty, when he saw her timidly advancing along the garden walk. He rose to meet her at once, and for a few moments after he had greeted her with kind civility she could do nothing but look inquiringly in his face, to know if he had any news to tell her of the object of her anxious solicitude. "I have heard nothing, Miss Oakley," he said, "that can give you any satisfaction concerning the fate of Mr. Thornhill, but we have much suspicion, I say we, because I have taken a friend into my confidence, that something serious must have happened to him, and that the barber, Sweeney Todd, in Fleet Street, at whose door the dog so mysteriously took his post, knows something of that circumstance, be it what it may." He led her to a seat as she spoke, and when she had recovered sufficiently the agitation of her feelings to speak, she said in a timid, hesitating voice, "Had Mr. Thornhill fair hair, and large, clear, grey eyes?" "Yes, he had such, and, I think, his smile was the most singularly beautiful I ever beheld in a man." "Heaven help me," said Johanna, "have you any reason for asking that question concerning Thornhill?" "God grant I had not. But, alas, I have truly. I feel that in Thornhill I must recognize Mark and Jestry himself." "You astonish me. It must be so, it must be so. You have described him to me, and I cannot doubt it. Mark and Jestry and Thornhill are one. I knew that he was going to change his name when he went out upon that wild adventure to the Indian Sea. I was well aware of that fact. I cannot think, Miss Oakley, that you are correct in that supposition. There are many things which induce me to think otherwise, and the first and foremost of them is that the ingenuous character of Mr. Thornhill forbids the likelihood of such a thing occurring. You may depend it is not, cannot be, as you suppose. The proofs are too strong for me, and I find I dare not doubt them. It is so, Colonel Jeffrey, as time, perhaps, may show. It is sad, very sad, to think that it is so, but I dare not doubt it, now that you have described him to me exactly as he lived. I must own that in giving an opinion on such a point to you, I may be accused of arrogance and presumption, for I have had no description of Mark in Jestry, and never saw him, and although you never saw certainly Mr. Thornhill, yet I have described him to you, and therefore you are able to judge from that description something of him. I am truly, and I cannot, dare not doubt. It is horrible to be positive on this point to me, because I do fear with you that something dreadful has occurred, and that the barber in Fleet Street could unravel a frightful secret, if he chose, connected with Mark and Jestry's fate. I do sincerely hope from my heart that you are wrong. I hope it, because I tell you frankly, dim and obscure as the hope that Mark and Jestry may have been picked up from the wreck of his vessel, it is yet stronger than the supposition that Thornhill has escaped the murderous hands of Sweeney Todd, the barber. Johanna looked in his face so imploringly, and with such an expression of hopelessness, that it was most sad truly to see her, and quite involuntarily he exclaimed, "If the sacrifice of my life would be to you a relief, and save you from the pangs you suffer, believe me, it should be made." She started as she said, "No, no, heaven knows enough has been sacrificed already, more than enough, much more than enough. But do not suppose that I am ungrateful for the generous interest you have taken in me. Do not suppose that I think any the less of the generosity and nobility of soul that would offer a sacrifice, because it is one that I would hesitate to accept. No, believe me, Colonel Jeffrey, that among the few names that are enrolled in my breast, and such to me will ever be honored, remember yours will be found while I live, but that will not be long, but that will not be long. No, do not speak so despairingly. Have I not cause for despair? Cause have you for great grief, but yet scarcely for despair. You are young yet, and let me entertain a hope that evening if a feeling of regret may mingle with your future thoughts, time will achieve something in tempering your sorrow, and if not great happiness, you may know yet great serenity. I dare not hope it, but I know your words are kindly spoken, and most kindly meant. You may well assure yourself that they are so. I will ascertain his fate, or perish. You alarm me by those words, as well as by your manner of uttering them. Let me implore you, Miss Oakley, to attempt nothing rash. Remember how weak and inefficient must be the exertions of a young girl like yourself, one who knows so little of the world, and can really understand so little of its wickedness. Affection conquers all obstacles, and the weakest and most inefficient girl that ever stepped, if she have strong within her that love which, in all its sacred intensity, knows no fear, shall truly accomplish much. I feel that, in such a cause, I could shake off all girlish terrors and ordinary alarms, and if there be danger, I would ask, what is life to me without all that could adorn it and make it beautiful? This, truly, is the very enthusiasm of affection, when, believe me, it will lead you to some excess, to some romantic exercise of feeling, such as will bring great danger in its train, to the unhappiness of those who love you, those who love me. Who is there to love me now? Johanna Oakley. I dare not and will not utter words that come thronging to my lips, but which I fear may be unwelcome to your ears. I will not say that I can answer the question that you have asked, because it would sound ungenerous at such a time as this, when you have met me to talk about the fate of another. Oh, forgive me, that, hurried away by the feeling of a moment, I have uttered these words, for I meant not to utter them. Johanna looked at him in silence, and it may be that there was the slightest possible tinge of reproach in her look, but it was very slight, for one glance at that ingenuous countenance would be sufficient to convince the most skeptical of the truth and single-mindedness of its owner. Of this there could be no doubt whatever, and if anything in the shape of a reproach was upon the point of coming from her lips, she forbore to utter it. May I hope, he added, that I have not lowered myself in your esteem, Miss Oakley, by what I have said? I hope, she said gently, that you will continue to be my friend. He laid an emphasis on the word friend, and he fully understood what she meant to imply by that, and after a moment's pause said, Heaven forbid that ever, by word or by action, Johanna, I should do aught to deprive myself of that privilege. Let me be yet your friend, since he left the sentence unfinished. But if he had added the words, since I can do no more, he could not have made it more evident to Johanna that those were the words he intended to utter. And now, he added, that I hope and trust we understand each other better than we did, and you are willing to call me by the name of friend. Let me once more ask of you, by the privilege of such a title, to be careful of yourself, and not to risk much in order that you may, perhaps, have some remote chance of achieving very little. But can I endure this dreadful suspense? It is, alas, too common an infliction on human nature. Johanna, pardon me for addressing you as Johanna. No, it requires no excuse. I am accustomed so to be addressed by all who feel a kindly interest for me. Call me Johanna if you will, and I shall feel a greater assurance of your friendship and your esteem. I will then avail myself of that permission, and again I will entreat you to leave to me the task of making what attempts may be made to discover the fate of Mr. Thornhill. There must be danger evening in inquiring for him, if he has met with any foul play, and therefore I ask you to let that danger be mine. Johanna asked herself if she should or not tell him of the scheme of operations that had been suggested by Arabella Wilmot, but, somehow or another, she shrank most wonderfully from so doing, both on account of the censure which she concluded he would be likely to cast upon it, and the romantic, strange nature of the plan itself. So she said, gently and quickly, I will attempt nothing that shall not have some possibility of success attending it. I will be careful, you may depend, for many considerations. My father, I know, centers all his affections in me, and for his sake I will be careful. I shall be content then, and now may I hope that this day week I may see you here again, in order that I may tell you if I have made any discovery, and that you may tell me the same, for my interest in Thornhill is that of a sincere friend, to say nothing of the deep interest in your happiness which I feel, and which now has become an element in the transaction of the highest value. I will come, said Johanna, if I can come. You do not doubt? No, no, I will come, and I hope to bring you some news of him in whom you are so much interested. It shall be no fault of mine if I come not. He walked with her from the gardens, and together they passed the shop of Sweeney Todd, but the door was close shut, and they saw nothing of the barber, or of that poor boy, his apprentice, who was so much to be pitied. He parted with Johanna near to her father's house, and he walked slowly away with his mind so fully impressed with the excellence and beauty of the spectacle maker's daughter, that it was quite clear, as long as he lived, he would not be able to rid himself of the favorable impression she had made upon him. I love her, he said, I love her, but she seems in no respect willing to enchain her affections. Alas, alas, how sad it is for me, that the being who above all others I could wish to call my own, instead of a joy to me, I have only encountered that she may impart a pang to my heart. Chapter 16. The Barber makes another attempt to sell the string of pearls. It would seem as if Sweeney Todd, after his adventure in already trying to dispose of the string of pearls which he possessed, began to feel little doubtful about his chances of success in that matter, for he waited patiently for a considerable period before he again made the attempt, and then he made it after a totally different fashion. Towards the close of night on that same evening when Johanna Oakley had met Colonel Jeffrey for the second time in the Temple Garden, and while Tobias sat alone in the shop in his usual deep dejection, a stranger entered the place, with a large blue bag in his hand, and looked inquiringly about him. "Hilloa, my lad," said he, "is this Mr. Todd's?" "Yes," said Tobias, "but he is not at home. What do you want?" "Well, I'll be hanged," said the man, "if this don't beat everything. You don't mean to tell me he is a barber, do you?" "Truly I do. Don't you see?" "Yes, I see to be sure, but I'll be shot if I thought of it beforehand. What do you think he has been doing?" "Doing," said Tobias, with animation. "Do you think he will be hung?" Why, no, I don't say it is a hanging matter, although you seem as if you wished it was, but I'll just tell you now we are artists at the west end of the town. Artists? Do you mean to say you draw pictures? No, no, we make clothes, but we call ourselves artists now because tailors are out of fashion. Oh, that's it, is it? Yes, that's it. And you would scarcely believe it, but he came to our shop actually and ordered a suit of clothes, which were to come to no less a sum than £30, and told us to make them up in such a style that they were to do for any nobleman, and he gave his name and address as Mr. Todd at this number in Fleet Street, but I hadn't the least idea that he was a barber. If I had, I'm quite certain the clothes would not have been finished in the style they are, but quite the reverse. Well, said Tobias, I can't think what he wants such clothing for, but I suppose it's all right. Was he a tall, ugly-looking fellow? As ugly as the very devil. I'll just show you the things as he is not at home. The coat is of the finest velvet, lined with silk and trimmed with lace. Did you ever, in all your life, see such a coat for a barber? Truly, I never did, but it is some scheme of his, of course. It is a superb coat. Yes, and all the rest of the dress is of the same style. What on earth he can be going to do with it I can't think, for it's only fit to go to court in. Oh, well, I know nothing about it, said Tobias, with a sigh. You can leave it or not as you like, it is all one to me. Well, you do seem the most melancholy wretch ever I came near. What's the matter with you? The matter with me? Oh, nothing. Of course, I am as happy as I can be. Ain't I Sweeney Todd's apprentice? And ain't that enough to make anybody sing all day long? It may be for all I know, but certainly you don't seem to be in a singing humor. But, however, we artists cannot waste our time, so just be so good as to take care of the clothes, and be sure you give them to your master, and so I wash my hands of the transaction. Very good, he shall have them. But do you mean to leave such valuable clothes without getting the money for them? Not exactly, for they are paid for. Oh, that makes all the difference. He shall have them. Scarcely had this tailor left the place when a boy arrived with a parcel, and, looking around him with undisguised astonishment, said, Isn't there some other Mr. Todd in Fleet Street? Not that I know of, said Tobias. What have you got there? Silk stockings, gloves, lace, cravats, ruffles, and so on. The deuce you have. I dare say it's all right. I shall leave them. They are paid for. This is the name, and this is the number. Now, stupid. This last exclamation arose from the fact that this boy, in going out, ran up against another who was coming in. Can't you see where you are going? Said the new arrival. What's that to you? I have a good mind to punch your head. Do it, and then come down our court and see what a licking I'll give you. Will you? Why don't you? Only let me catch you, that's all. They stood for some moments so closely together that their noses very nearly touched, and then, after mutual assertions of what they would do if they caught each other, although, in either case, to stretch out an arm would have been quite sufficient to have accomplished that object, they separated, and the last comer said to Tobias, in a tone of irritation, probably consequent upon the misunderstanding he had just had with the hosier's boy, You can tell Mr. Todd that the carriage will be ready at 7:30 precisely, and then he went away, leaving Tobias in a state of great bewilderment as to what Sweeney Todd could possibly be about to do with such an amount of finery as that which was evidently coming home for him. I can't make it out, he said. It's some villainy, of course, but I can't make out what it is. I wish I knew. I may thwart him in it. He is a villain, and neither could nor would project anything good, but what can I do? I am quite helpless in this, and will just let it take its course. I can only wish for a power of action I shall never possess. Alas, alas, I am very sad, and know not what will become of me. I wish that I was in my grave, and there I am sure I shall be soon, unless something happens to turn the tide of all this wretched evil fortune that has come upon me. It was in vain for Tobias to think of vexing himself with conjectures as to what Sweeney Todd was about to do with so much finery, for he had not the remotest foundation to go upon in the matter. and could not for the life of him imagine any possible contingency or chance which should make it necessary for the barber to deck himself in such gaudy apparel. All he could do was to lay down in his own mind a general principle as regarded Sweeney Todd's conduct, and that consisted in the fact that whatever may be his plans, and whatever may be his objects, they were for no good purpose, but, on the contrary, were most certainly intended for the accomplishment of some great evil which that most villainous person intended to perpetrate. I will observe all I can, thought Tobias to himself, and do what I can to put a stop to his mischiefs, but I fear it will be very little he will allow me to observe, and perhaps still less that he will allow me to do, but I can but try, and do my best. Poor Tobias's best, as regarded achieving anything against Sweeney Todd, we may well suppose would be little truly, for that individual was not the man to give anybody an opportunity of doing much, and, possessed as he was of the most consummate art, as well as the greatest possible amount of unscrupulousness, there can be very little doubt but that any attempt poor Tobias may make would recoil upon himself. In about half an hour the barber returned, and his first question was, "Have any things been left for me?" "Yes, sir," said Tobias. "Here are 2 parcels, and a boy has been to say that the carriage will be ready at 7:30 precisely." "It is well," said the barber, "that will do. And Tobias, you will be careful, whilst I am gone, of the shop. I shall be back in half an hour, mind you, and not later, and be sure that I find you here at your post. But you may say, if any one comes here on business, there will be neither shaving nor dressing tonight. You understand me?" "Yes, sir, certainly." Sweeney Todd then took the bundles which contained the costly apparel, and retired into the parlor with them, and, as it was then 7 o'clock, Tobias correctly enough supposed that he had gone to dress himself, and he waited with a considerable amount of curiosity to see what sort of an appearance the barber would cut in his fine apparel. Tobias had not to control his impatience long, for in less than 20 minutes, out came Sweeney Todd, attired in the very height of fashion for the period. His waistcoat was something positively gorgeous, and his fingers were loaded with such costly rings that they quite dazzled the sight of Tobias to look upon. Then, moreover, he wore a sword with a jeweled hilt, but it was one which Tobias really thought he had seen before, for he had a recollection that a gentleman had come to have his hair dressed, and had taken it off, and laid just such a sword across his hat during the operation. "Remember," said Sweeney Todd, "remember your instructions, obey them to the letter, and no doubt you will ultimately become happy and independent." With these words, Sweeney Todd left the place, and poor Tobias looked after him with a frown as he repeated the words happy and independent. Alas, what a mockery it is of this man to speak to me in such a way. I only wish that I were dead. But we will leave Tobias to his own reflections, and follow the more interesting progress of Sweeney Todd, who, for some reason best known to himself, was then playing so grand a part, and casting away so large a sum of money. He made his way to a livery stables in the immediate neighborhood, and there, sure enough, the horses were being placed to a handsome carriage, and all being very soon in readiness, Sweeney Todd gave some whispered directions to the driver, and the vehicle started off westward. At that time Hyde Park Corner was very nearly out of town, and it looked as if you were getting a glimpse of the country, and actually seeing something of the peasantry of England, when you got another couple of miles off, and that was the direction in which Sweeney Todd went, and as he goes, we may as well introduce to the reader the sort of individual whom he was going to visit in so much state, and for whom he thought it necessary to go to such great expense. At that period the follies and vices of the nobility were somewhere about as great as they are now, and consequently extravagance induced on many occasions tremendous sacrifice of money, and it was found extremely convenient on many occasions for them to apply to a man of the name of John Mundell, an exceedingly wealthy person, a Dutchman by extraction, who was reported to make immense sums of money by lending to the nobility and others what they required on emergencies, at enormous rates of interest. But it must not be supposed that John Mundell was so confiding as to lend his money without security. It was quite the reverse, for he took care to have the jewels, some costly plate, or the title deeds of an estate, perhaps, as security before he would part with a single shilling of his cash. In point of fact, John Mundell was nothing more than a pawnbroker on a very extensive scale, and although he had an office in town, he usually received his more aristocratic customers at his private residence, which was about 2 miles off, on the Uxbridge Road. After this explanation, it can very easily be imagined what was the scheme of Sweeney Todd, and that he considered, if he borrowed from John Mundell a sum equal in amount to half the real value of the pearls, he should be well rid of a property which he certainly could not sufficiently well account for the possession of, to enable him to dispose of it openly to the highest bidder. We give Sweeney Todd great credit for the scheme he proposed. It was eminently calculated to succeed, and one which, in the way he undertook it, was certainly set about in the best possible style. During the ride, he revolved in his mind exactly what he should say to John Mundell, and, from what we know of him, we may be well convinced that Sweeney Todd was not likely to fail from any amount of bashfulness in the transaction, but that, on the contrary, he was just the man to succeed in any scheme which required great assurance to carry it through, for he was most certainly master of great assurance, and possessed of a kind of diplomatic skill, which, had fortune placed him in a more elevated position of life, would no doubt have made a great man of him, and gained him great political reputation. John Mundell's villa, which was called, by the by, Mundell House, was a large, handsome, and modern structure, surrounded by a few acres of pleasure gardens, which, however, the money-lender never looked at, for his whole soul was too much engrossed by his love for cash to enable him to do so, and, if he derived any satisfaction at all from it, that satisfaction must have been entirely owing to the fact that he had wrung mansion, grounds, and all the costly furnishing of the former from an improvident debtor who had been forced to fly the country and leave his property wholly in the hands of the moneylender and usurer. It was but a short drive with the really handsome horses that Sweeney Todd had succeeded in hiring for the occasion, and he soon found himself opposite the entrance gates of the residence of John Mundell. His great object now was that the usurer should see the equipage which he had brought down, and he accordingly desired the footman who accompanied him at once to ring the bell at the entrance gate, and to say that a gentleman was waiting in his carriage to see Mr. Mundell. This was done, and when the moneylender's servant reported to him that the equipage was a costly one, and that, in his opinion, the visitor must be some nobleman of great rank, John Mundell made no difficulty about the matter, but walked down to the gate at once, where he immediately mentally subscribed to the opinion of his servant, by admitting to himself that the equipage was faultless, and presumed at once that it did belong to some person of great rank. He was proportionally humble, as such men always are, and, advancing to the side of the carriage, he begged to know what commands his lordship, for so he called him at once, had for him. The barber acts the duke to pawn the pearls. The barber acts the duke to pawn the pearls. I wish to know, said Sweeney Todd, Mr. Mundell, if you are inclined to lay under an obligation a rather illustrious lady, by helping her out of a little pecuniary difficulty. John Mundell glanced again at the equipage, and he likewise saw something of the rich dress of his visitor, who had not disputed the title which had been applied to him, of lord, and he made up his mind accordingly that it was just one of the transactions that would suit him, provided the security that would be offered was of a tangible nature. Chapter 14. The Great Change in the Prospects of Sweeney Todd. As Sweeney Todd's object, so far as regarded the moneylender having seen the carriage, was fully answered, he had no objection to enter the house, which he accordingly did at once, being preceded by John Mundell, who became each moment more and more impressed with the fact, as he considered it, that his guest was some person of very great rank and importance in society. He ushered him into a splendidly furnished apartment, and after offering him refreshments, which Sweeney Todd politely declined, he waited with no small degree of impatience for his visitor to be more explicit with regard to the object of his visit. I should, said Sweeney Todd, have myself accommodated the illustrious lady with the sum of money she requires, but as I could not do so without encumbering some estates, she positively forbade me to think of it. Certainly, said Mr. Mundell, she is a very illustrious lady, I presume? Very illustrious truly, but it must be a condition of this transaction, if you at all enter into it, that you are not to inquire precisely who she is, nor are you to inquire precisely who I am. It's not my usual way of conducting business, but if everything else be satisfactory, I shall not cavil at that. Very good. By everything else being satisfactory, I presume you mean the security offered? Why, yes, that is of great importance, my lord. I informed the illustrious lady that, as the affair was to be wrapped up in something of a mystery, the security must be extremely ample. That's a very proper view to take of the matter, my lord. I wonder, thought John Mundle, if he is a duke. I'll call him your grace next time, and see if he objects to it. Therefore, continued Sweeney Todd, the illustrious lady placed in my hands security to a third greater amount than she required. Certainly, certainly, a very proper arrangement, your grace. May I ask the nature of the proffered security? Jewels, highly satisfactory and unexceptionable security. They go into a small space, and do not deteriorate in value. And if they do, said the barber, deteriorate in value, it would make no difference to you, for the illustrious person's honor would be committed to your redemption. I don't doubt that, your grace, in the least. I merely made the remark incidentally, quite incidentally. Of course, and I trust, before going further, that you are quite in a position to enter into this subject. Certainly I am, and I am proud to say, to any amount. Show me the money's worth, your grace, and I will show you the money. That's my way of doing business, and no one can say that John Mundle ever shrunk from a matter that was brought fairly before him, and that he considered worth his going into. It was by hearing such a character of you that I was induced to come to you. What do you think of that? Sweeney Todd took from his pocket, with a careless air, the string of pearls, and cast them down before the eyes of the moneylender, who took them up and ran them rapidly through his fingers for a few seconds before he said, I thought there was but one string like this in the kingdom, and those belonged to the Queen. Well, said Sweeney Todd, I humbly beg your grace's pardon. How much money does your grace require on these pearls? £12,000 is their current value. If a sale of them was enforced, £8,000 are required of you on their security. 8,000 is a large sum. As a general thing I lend but half the value upon anything, but in this case, to oblige your grace and the illustrious personage, I do not, of course, hesitate for one moment but shall for 1 month lend you the required amount. That will do, said Sweeney Todd, scarcely concealing the exultation he felt at getting so much more from John Mundle than he expected, and which he certainly would not have got if the moneylender had not been most fully and completely impressed with the idea that the pearls belonged to the Queen, and that he had actually at length majesty itself for a customer. He did not suppose for one moment that it was the Queen who wanted the money, but his view of the case was that she had lent the pearls to this nobleman to meet some exigency of his own, and that, of course, they would be redeemed very shortly. Altogether a more pleasant transaction for John Mundle could not have been imagined. It was just the sort of thing he would have looked out for, and had the greatest satisfaction in bringing to a conclusion, and he considered it was opening the door to the highest class of business in his way that he was capable of doing. In what name, your grace, he said, shall I draw a check upon my banker? In the name of Colonel George. Certainly, and if your grace will give me an acknowledgment for £8,000, and please to understand that at the end of a month from this time the transaction will be renewed if necessary, I will give you a check for £7,500. Why 7,500 only, when you mentioned £8,000? The £500 is my little commission upon the transaction. Your grace will perceive that I appreciate highly the honor of your grace's custom, and consequently charge the lowest possible price. I can assure your grace I could get more for my money by a great deal, but the pleasure of being able to meet your grace's views is so great, that I am willing to make a sacrifice, and therefore it is that I say 500, when I really ought to say £1,000, taking into consideration the great scarcity of money at the present juncture, and I can assure your grace that, peace, said Sweeney Todd, and if it be not convenient to redeem the jewels at the end of a month from this time, you will hear from me most assuredly. I am quite satisfied of that, said John Mundle, and he accordingly drew a check for £7,500, which he handed to Sweeney Todd, who put it in his pocket, not a little delighted that at last he had got rid of his pearls, evening at a price so far beneath their real value. "I need scarcely urge upon you, Mr. Mundle," he said, "the propriety of keeping this affair profoundly secret. Truly you need not, your grace, for it is part of my business to be discreet and cautious. I should very soon have nothing to do in my line, your grace may depend, if I were to talk about it. No, this transaction will forever remain locked up in my own breast, and no living soul but your grace and I need know what has occurred." With this, John Mundle showed Sweeney Todd to his carriage, with abundance of respect, and in 2 minutes more he was traveling along towards town with what may be considered a small fortune in his pocket. We should have noticed earlier that Sweeney Todd had, upon the occasion of his going to sell the pearls to the lapidary in the city, made some great alterations in his appearance, so that it was not likely he should be recognized again to a positive certainty. For example, having no whiskers whatever of his own, he had put on a large black pair of false ones, as well as mustachios, and he had given some color to his cheeks likewise, which had so completely altered his appearance that those who were most intimate with him would not have known him except by his voice, and that he took good care to alter in his intercourse with John Mundle, so that it should not become a future means of detection. "I thought that this would succeed," he muttered to himself as he went towards town, "and I have not been deceived. For 3 months longer, and only 3, I will carry on the business in Fleet Street, so that any sudden alteration in my fortunes may not give rise to suspicion." He was then silent for some minutes, during which he appeared to be revolving some very knotty question in his brain, and then he said, suddenly, well, as regards Tobias, I think it will be safer, unquestionably, to put him out of the way by taking his life, than to try to dispose of him in a madhouse, and I think there are 1 or 2 more persons whom it will be highly necessary to prevent being mischievous, at all events at present. I must think. When such a man as Sweeney Todd set about thinking, there could be no possible doubt but that some serious mischief was meditated, and any one who could have watched his face during that ride home from the moneylenders would have seen by its expression that the thoughts which agitated him were of a dark and desperate character, and such as anybody but himself would have shrunk from aghast. But he was not a man to shrink from anything, and, on the contrary, the more a set of circumstances presented themselves in a gloomy and a terrific aspect, the better they seemed to suit him and the peculiar constitution of his mind. There can be no doubt but that the love of money was the predominant feeling in Sweeney Todd's intellectual organization, and that, by the amount it would bring him, or the amount it would deprive him of, he measured everything. With such a man, then, no question of morality or ordinary feeling could arise, and there can be no doubt that he would quite willingly have sacrificed the whole human race, if, by so doing, he could have achieved any of the objects of his ambition. And so, on his road homeward, he probably made up his mind to plunge still deeper into criminality, and perhaps to indulge in acts that a man not already so deeply versed in iniquity would have shrunk from with the most positive terror. And by a strange style of reasoning, such men as Sweeney Todd reconcile themselves to the most heinous crimes upon the ground of what they call policy, that is to say, that having committed some serious offense, they are compelled to commit a great number more for the purpose of endeavoring to avoid the consequences of the first lot, and therefore the continuance of criminality becomes a matter necessary to self-defense, and an essential ingredient in their consideration of self-preservation. Probably Sweeney Todd had been for the greater part of his life aiming at the possession of extensive pecuniary resources, and, no doubt, by the aid of a superior intellect and a mind full of craft and design, he had managed to make others subservient to his views, and now that those views were answered and that his underlings and accomplices were no longer required, they became positively dangerous. He was well aware of that cold-blooded policy which teaches that it is far safer to destroy than to cast away the tools by which a man carves his way to power and fortune. "They shall die," said Sweeney Todd, Dead men tell no tales, nor women nor boys either, and they shall all die, after which there will, I think, be a serious fire in Fleet Street. Ha! Ha! It may spread to what mischief it likes, always provided it stops not short of the entire destruction of my house and premises. Rare sport will it be to me, for then I will at once commence a new career, in which the barber will be forgotten, and the man of fashion only seen and remembered, for with this sad addition to my means, I am fully capable of vying with the highest and the noblest, let them be whom they may. This seemed a pleasant train of reflections to Sweeney Todd, and as the coach entered Fleet Street, there sat such a grim smile upon his countenance that he looked like some fiend in human shape, who had just completed the destruction of a human soul. When he reached the livery stables to which he directed them to drive, instead of his own shop, he rewarded all who had gone with him most liberally, so that the coachman and footman, who were both servants out of place, would have had no objection for Sweeney Todd every day to have gone on some such an expedition, so that they should receive as liberal wages for the small part they enacted in it as they did upon that occasion. He then walked from the stables toward his own house, but upon reaching there a little disappointment awaited him, for he found to his surprise that no light was burning, and when he placed his hand upon the shop door, it opened, but there was no trace of Tobias, although he, Sweeney Todd, called loudly upon him the moment he set foot within the shop. Then a feeling of apprehension crept across the barber, and he groped anxiously about for some matches, by the aid of which he hoped to procure a light, and then an explanation of the mysterious absence of Tobias. Chapter 15. Tobias's adventures during the absence of Sweeney Todd. Tobias guessed, and guessed rightly too, that when Sweeney Todd said he would be away half an hour, he only mentioned that short period of time, in order to keep the lad's vigilance on the alert, and to prevent him from taking any advantage of a more protracted absence. The very style and manner in which he had gone out precluded the likelihood of it being for so short a period of time, and that circumstance set Tobias seriously thinking over a situation which was becoming more intolerable every day. The lad had the sense to feel that he could not go on much longer as he was going on, and that in a short time such a life would destroy him. "It is beyond endurance," he said, "and I know not what to do. And since Sweeney Todd has told me that the boy he had before went out of his senses, and is now in the cell of a madhouse, I feel that such will be my fate, and that I too shall come to that dreadful end, and then no one will believe a word I utter, but consider everything to be mere raving." After a time, as the darkness increased, he lit the lamp which hung in the shop, and which, until it was closed for the night, usually shed a dim ray from the window. Then he sat down to think again, and he said to himself, "If I could now but summon courage to ask my mother about this robbery which Sweeney Todd imputes to her, she may assure me it was false, and that she never did such a deed. But then it is dreadful for me to ask her such a question, because it may be true, and then how shocking it would be for her to be forced to confess to me, her own son, such a circumstance." These were the honorable feelings which prevented Tobias from questioning his mother as regarded Todd's accusation of her, an accusation too dreadful to believe implicitly, and yet sufficiently probable for him to have a strong suspicion that it may be true after all. It is to be deeply regretted that Tobias's philosophy did not carry him a little further, and make him see, the moment the charge was made, that he ought unquestionably to investigate it to the very utmost. But still we could hardly expect, from a mere boy, that acute reasoning and power of action, which depends so much upon the knowledge of the world and an extensive practice in the usages of society. It was sufficient, if he felt correctly. We could scarcely expect him to reason so, but upon this occasion, above all others, he seemed completely overcome by the circumstances which surrounded him, and from his excited manner, one may have almost imagined that the insanity he himself predicted at the close of his career was really not far off. He wrung his hands, and he wept, every now and then, in sad speech, bitterly bemoaning his situation, until at length, with a sudden resolution, he sprang to his feet, exclaiming, "This night shall end it. I can endure it no more. I will fly from this place, and seek my fortune elsewhere." Any amount of distress, danger, or death itself evening is preferable to the dreadful life I lead. He walked some paces towards the door, and then he paused, as he said to himself in a low tone, Todd will surely not be home yet awhile, and why should I then neglect the only opportunity I may ever have of searching this house to satisfy my mind as regards any of the mysteries that it contains? He paused over this thought, and considered well its danger, for dangerous truly it was to no small extent, but he was desperate, and with a resolution that scarcely could have been expected from him, he determined upon taking that step, above all others, which Todd was almost sure to punish with death. He closed the shop door, and bolted it upon the inside, so that he could not be suddenly interrupted, and then he looked round him carefully for some weapon, by the aid of which he should be able to break his way into the parlor, which the barber always kept closed and locked in his absence, a weapon that would answer the purpose of breaking any lock if he, Tobias, chose to proceed so roughly to work, was close at hand in the iron bar, which, when the place was closed at night, secured a shutter to the door. Wrought up as he was to almost frenzy, Tobias seized this bar, and, advancing towards the parlor door, he with one blow smashed the lock to atoms, and the door yielded. The moment it did so, there was a crash of glass, and when Tobias entered the room he saw that upon its threshold lay a wine-glass shattered to atoms, and he felt certain that it had been placed in some artful position by Sweeney Todd as a detector, when he should return, of any attempt that had been made upon the door of the parlor. And now Tobias felt that he was so far committed that he may as well go on with his work, and accordingly he lit a candle, which he found upon the parlor table, and then proceeded to make what discoveries he could. Several of the cupboards in the room yielded at once to his hands, and in them he found nothing remarkable, but there was one that he could not open, so, without a moment's hesitation, he had recourse to the bar of iron again, and broke its lock, when the door swung open, and to his astonishment there tumbled out of this cupboard such a volley of hats of all sorts and descriptions, some looped with silver, some three-cornered, and some square, that they formed quite a museum of that article of attire, and excited the greatest surprise in the mind of Tobias, at the same time that they tended very greatly to confirm some other thoughts and feelings which he had concerning Sweeney Todd. This was the only cupboard which was fast, although there was another door which looked as if it opened into one, but when Tobias broke that down with the bar of iron, he found it was the door which led to the staircase conducting to the upper part of the house, that upper part which Sweeney Todd, with all his avarice, would never let, and of which the shutters were kept continually closed, so that the opposite neighbors never caught a glimpse into any of the apartments. With cautious and slow steps, which he adopted instantaneously, although he knew that there was no one in the house but himself, Tobias ascended the staircase. I will go to the very top rooms first, he said to himself, and so examine them all as I come down, and then if Todd should return suddenly, I shall have a better chance of hearing him than as if I began below and went upwards. Acting upon this prudent scheme, he went up to the attics, all the doors of which were swinging open, and there was nothing in any of them whatever. He descended to the second floor with the like result, and a feeling of great disappointment began to creep over him at the thought that, after all, the barber's house may not repay the trouble of examination. But, when he reached the first floor he soon found abundant reason to alter his opinion. The doors were fast, and he had to burst them open, and, when he got in, he found that those rooms were partially furnished, and that they contained a great quantity of miscellaneous property of all kinds and descriptions. In one corner was an enormous quantity of walking sticks, some of which were of a very costly and expensive character, with gold and silver chased tops to them, and in another corner was a great number of umbrellas, in fact, at least 100 of them. Then there were boots and shoes lying upon the floor, partially covered up, as if to keep them from dirt. There were 30 or 40 swords of different styles and patterns, many of them appearing to be very firm blades, and in one or two cases the scabbards were richly ornamented. At one end of the front and larger of these two rooms was an old-fashioned looking bureau of great size, and with as much woodwork in it as seemed required to make at least a couple of such articles of furniture. This was very securely locked, and presented more difficulties in the way of opening it than any of the doors had done. for the lock was of great strength and apparent durability. Moreover, it was not so easily got at, but at length by using the bar as a sort of lever, instead of as a mere machine to strike with. Tobias succeeded in forcing this bureau open, and then his eyes were perfectly dazzled with the amount of jewelry and trinkets of all kinds and descriptions that were exhibited to his gaze. There was a great number of watches, gold chains, silver and gold snuff boxes, and a large assortment of rings, shoe buckles, and brooches. These articles must have been of great value, and Tobias could not help exclaiming aloud, how could Sweeney Todd come by these articles, except by the murder of their owners? This, truly, seemed but too probable a supposition, and the more especially so, as in a further part of this bureau a great quantity of apparel was found by Tobias. He stood with a candle in his hand, looking upon these various objects for more than a quarter of an hour, and then, as a sudden and a natural thought came across him of how completely a few of them evening would satisfy his wants and his mother's for a long time to come, he stretched forth his hand towards the glittering mass, but he drew it back again with a shudder, saying, "No, no, these things are the plunder of the dead. Let Sweeney Todd keep them to himself, and look upon them, if he can, with eyes of enjoyment. I will have none of them. They would bring misfortune along with every guinea that they may be turned into." As he spoke, he heard St. Dunstan's clock strike 9, and he started at the sound, for it let him know that already Sweeney Todd had been away an hour beyond the time he said he would be absent, so that there was a probability of his quick return now, and it would scarcely be safe to linger longer in his house. "I must be gone, I must be gone. I should like to look upon my mother's face once more before I leave London for ever perhaps. I may tell her of the danger she is in from Todd's knowledge of her secret. No, no, I cannot speak to her of that. I must go, and leave her to those chances which I hope and trust will work favorably for her." Flinging down the iron bar which had done him such good service, Tobias stopped not to close any of those receptacles which contained the plunder that Sweeney Todd had taken most probably from murdered persons, but he rushed downstairs into the parlor again, where the boots that had fallen out of the cupboard still lay upon the floor in wild disorder. It was a strange and sudden whim that took him, rather than a matter of reflection, that induced him, instead of his own hat, to take one of those which were lying so indiscriminately at his feet, and he did so. By mere accident it turned out to be an exceedingly handsome hat, of rich workmanship and material, and then Tobias, feeling terrified lest Sweeney Todd should return before he could leave the place, paid no attention to anything, but turned from the shop, merely pulling the door after him, and then darting over the road towards the Temple like a hunted hare, for his great wish was to see his mother, and then he had an undefined notion that his best plan for escaping the clutches of Sweeney Todd would be to go to sea, in common with all boys of his age, who know nothing whatever of the life of a sailor. It presented itself in the most fascinating colors. A sailor ashore and a sailor afloat are about as two different things as the world can present, but, to the imagination of Tobias Ragg, a sailor was somebody who was always dancing hornpipes, spending money, and telling wonderful stories. No wonder, then, that the profession presented itself under such fascinating colors to all such persons as Tobias, and as it seemed, and seems still, to be a sort of general understanding that the real condition of a sailor should be mystified in every possible way and shape by both novelist and dramatist. It is no wonder that it requires actual experience to enable those parties who are in the habit of being carried away by just what they hear, to come to a correct conclusion. "I will go to sea," ejaculated Tobias. "Yes, I will go to sea." As he spoke these words he passed out of the gate of the temple leading into Whitefriars, in which ancient vicinity his mother dwelt, endeavoring to eke out a living as best she may. She was very much surprised, for she happened to be at home at the unexpected visit of her son, Tobias, and uttered a faint scream as she let fall a flat iron very nearly upon his toes. "Mother," he said, "I cannot stay with Sweeney Todd any longer, so do not ask me." "Not stay with such a respectable man?" "A respectable man, mother. Alas, alas, how little you know of him." "But what am I saying? I dare not speak. Oh, that fatal, fatal candlestick! But how are you to live? And what do you mean by a fatal candlestick? Forgive me, I did not mean to say that. Farewell, mother. I am going to see. To see what, my dear? Said Mrs. Ragg, who was much more difficult to talk to than Evening Hamlet's grave digger. You don't know how much I am obliged to Sweeney Todd. Yes, I do, and that's what drives me mad to think of. Farewell, mother, perhaps forever. If I can, of course I will communicate with you, but now I dare not stay. Oh, what have you done, Tobias? What have you done? Nothing, nothing, but Sweeney Todd is. What? No matter, no matter. Nothing, nothing. And yet at this last moment I am almost tempted to ask you concerning a candlestick. Don't mention that, said Mrs. Ragg. I don't want to hear anything said about it. It is true, then? Yes, but did Mr. Todd tell you? He did. I have now asked the question I never thought could have passed my lips. Farewell, mother, forever farewell. Tobias rushed out of the place, leaving old Mrs. Ragg astonished at his behavior, and with a strong suspicion that some accession of insanity had come over him. The Lord have mercy upon us, she said. What shall I do? I am astonished at Mr. Todd telling him about the candlestick. It's true enough, though, for all that. I recollect it as well as though it were yesterday. It was a very hard winter, and I was minding a set of chambers when Todd came to shave the gentleman, and I saw him with my own eyes put a silver candlestick in his pocket. Then I went over to his shop and reasoned with him about it, and he gave it me back again, and I brought it to the chambers, and laid it down exactly on the spot where he took it from. To be sure, said Mrs. Ragg, after a pause of a few moments, to be sure, he has been a very good friend to me ever since, but that I suppose is for fear I should tell, and get him hung or transported. But, however, we must take the good with the bad, and when Tobias comes to think of it, he will go back again to his work, I dare say, for, after all, it's a very foolish thing for him to trouble his head whether Mr. Chapter 16. The Strange Odor in Old St. Dunstan's Church. About this time, and while the incidents of our most strange and eventful narrative were taking place, the pious frequenters of Old St. Dunstan's Church began to perceive a strange and most abominable odor throughout that sacred edifice. It was in vain that old women who came to hear the sermons, although they were too deaf to catch a third part of them, brought smelling bottles and other means of stifling their noses. Still that dreadful charnel house sort of smell would make itself most painfully and most disagreeably apparent. And the Ref. Joseph still in port, who was the regular preacher, smelt it in the pulpit, and had been seen to sneeze in the amid of a most pious discourse truly, and to hold to his pious mouth a handkerchief, in which was some strong and pungent essence, for the purpose of trying to overcome the horrible effluvia. The organ blower and the organ player were both nearly stifled, for the horrible odor seemed to ascend to the upper part of the church, although those who sat in what may be called the pit by no means escaped it. The churchwardens looked at each other in their pews with contorted countenances, and were almost afraid to breathe, and the only person who did not complain bitterly of the dreadful odor in St. Dunstan's Church was an old woman who had been a pew opener for many years, but then she had lost the faculties of her nose, which, perhaps, accounted satisfactorily for that circumstance. At length, however, the nuisance became so intolerable that the beadle, whose duty it was in the morning to open the church doors, used to come up to them with the massive key in one hand and a cloth soaked in vinegar in the other, just as the people used to do in the time of the Great Plague of London, and when he had opened the doors he used to run over to the other side of the way. Ah, Mr. Blunt, he used to say to the bookseller, who lived opposite. Ah, Mr. Blunt, I is obligated to cut over here, leastways till the atmospheric air is mixed up all along with the stinkifications which come from the church. By this it will be seen that the beadle was rather a learned man, and no doubt went to some mechanics' institution of those days, where he learned something of everything but what was calculated to be of some service to him, as may be supposed, from the fact that this sort of thing had gone on for a few months. it began to excite some attention with a view to a remedy, for, in the great city of London, a nuisance of any sort or description requires to become venerable by age before any one thinks of removing it, and after that, it is quite clear that that becomes a good argument against removing it at all. But at last, the churchwardens began to have a fear that some pestilential disease would be the result if they for any longer period of time put up with the horrible stench, and that they may be among its first victims, so they began to ask each other what could be done to obviate it. Probably, if this frightful stench, being suggestive, as it was, of all sorts of horrors, had been graciously pleased to confine itself to some poor locality, nothing would have been heard of it. But when it became actually offensive to a gentleman in a metropolitan pulpit, and when it began to make itself perceptible to the sleepy faculties of the churchwardens of St. Dunstan's Church, Fleet Street, so as to prevent them evening from dozing through the afternoon sermon, it became a very serious matter truly. But what was it? What could it be? And what was to be done to get rid of it? These were the anxious questions that were asked right and left, as regarded the serious nuisance, without the fates graciously acceding any reply. But yet one thing seemed to be generally agreed, and that was that it did come, and must come, somehow or other, out of the vaults from beneath the church. But then, as the pious and hypocritical Mr. Butterwick, who lived opposite, said, how could that be, when it was satisfactorily proved by the present books that no body had been buried in the vaults for some time, and therefore it was a very odd thing that dead people, after leaving off smelling and being disagreeable, should all of a sudden burst out again in that line, and be twice as bad as ever they were at first. And on Wednesdays sometimes, too, when pious people were not satisfied with a Sunday's devotion, but began again in the middle of the week, that stench was positively terrific. Truly, so bad was it, that some of the congregation were forced to leave, and have been seen to slink into Bell Yard, where Lovett's pie shop was situated, and then and there solace themselves with a pork or a veal pie, in order that their mouths and noses should be full of a delightful and agreeable flavor, instead of one most peculiarly and decidedly the reverse. At last there was a confirmation to be held at St. Dunstan's Church, and a great concourse of persons assembled, for a sermon was to be preached by the bishop after the confirmation, and a very great fuss truly was to be made about really nobody knew exactly what. Preparations, as newspapers say, upon an extensive scale, and regardless of expense, were made for the purpose of adding luster to the ceremony and surprising the bishop, when he came, with a good idea that the people who attended St. Dunstan's Church were somebodies and really worth confirming. The confirmation was to take place at 12 o'clock, and the bells ushered in the morning with their most pious tones, for it was not every day that the authorities of St. Dunstan succeeded in catching a bishop, and when they did so, they were determined to make the most of him, and the numerous authorities, including churchwardens, and even the very beadle, were in an uncommon fluster, and running about, and impeding each other, as authorities always do upon public occasions. But, to those who only look to the surface of things, and who came to admire what was grand and magnificent in the preparations, the beadle certainly carried away the palm, for that functionary was attired in a completely new cocked hat and coat, and certainly looked very splendid and showy upon the occasion. Moreover, that beadle had been well and judiciously selected, and the parish authorities made no secret of it, when there was an election for beadle, that they threw all their influence into the scale of that candidate who happened to be the biggest, and consequently who was calculated to wear the official costume with an air that no smaller man could have possibly aspired to on any account. At 11:30 the bishop made his gracious appearance, and was duly ushered into the vestry, where there was a comfortable fire, and on the table in which, likewise, were certain cold chickens and bottles of rare wines, for confirming a number of people, and preaching a sermon besides, was considered no joke, and may, for all they knew, be provocative of a great appetite in the bishop. And with what a bland and courtly air the bishop smiled as he ascended the steps of St. Dunstan's Church, how affable he was to the churchwardens, and he actually smiled upon a poor miserable charity boy who, his eyes glaring wide open, and his muffin cap in his hand, was taking his first stare at a real live bishop. To be sure, the beadle knocked him down directly the bishop had passed for having the presumption to look at such a great personage, but then that was to be expected fully and completely, and only proved that the proverb, which permits a cat to look at a king, is not equally applicable to charity boys and bishops. When the bishop got to the vestry, some very complimentary words were uttered to him by the usual officiating clergyman, but, somehow or other, the bland smile had left the lips of the great personage, and, interrupting the vicar in the mid of a fine flowing speech, he said, "That's all very well, but what a terrible stink there is here." The churchwardens gave a groan, for they had flattered themselves that perhaps the bishop would not notice the dreadful smell, or that, if he did, he would think it was accidental, and say nothing about it. But now, when he really did mention it, they found all their hopes scattered to the winds, and that it was necessary to say something. "Is this horrid charnel house sort of smell always here?" "I am afraid it is," said one of the churchwardens. "Afraid," said the bishop, "surely you know, you seem to me to have a nose." "Yes," said the churchwarden, in great confusion, "I have that honor, and I have the pleasure of informing you, my lord bishop, I have the honor of informing you that this smell is always here." The bishop sniffed several times, and then he said, "It is very dreadful, and I hope that by the next time I come to St. Dunstan's you will have the pleasure and the honor, both, of informing me that it has gone away." The churchwarden bowed and got into an extreme corner, saying to himself, "This is the bishop's last visit here, and I don't wonder at it, for, as if out of pure spite, the smell is 10 times worse than ever today." And so it was, for it seemed to come up through all the crevices of the flooring of the church, with a power and perseverance that was positively dreadful. The people coughed and held their handkerchiefs to their noses, remarking to each other, "Isn't it dreadful? Did you ever know the smell in St. Dunstan's so bad before?" And everybody agreed that they never had known it anything like so bad, for that it was positively awful, and so truly it was. The anxiety of the bishop to get away was quite manifest, and if he could have decently taken his departure without confirming anybody at all, there is no doubt but that he would have willingly done so, and left all the congregation to die and be something or another. But this he could not do, but he could cut it short, and he did so. The people found themselves confirmed before they almost knew where they were, and the bishop would not go into the vestry again on any account, but hurried down the steps of the church, and into his carriage, with the greatest precipitation in the world, thus proving that holiness is no proof against a most abominable stench. As may be well supposed, after this, the subject assumed a much more serious aspect, and on the following day a solemn meeting was held of all the church authorities, at which it was determined that men should be employed to make a thorough and searching examination of the vaults of St. Dunstan's, with the view of discovering, if possible, from where particularly the abominable stench emanated.